Before the rise of the Ashanti Empire, the region known today as southern Ghana was a mosaic of small states, shifting alliances, and complex trade networks. It was not an empty wilderness awaiting civilization, but rather a vibrant zone of social, political, and economic activity. Stretching from the Atlantic coast inland toward the dense tropical forests, this area, later dubbed the Gold Coast by European traders, was home to diverse Akan-speaking peoples, whose traditions, rivalries, and cultural innovations laid the groundwork for what would become the Ashanti Empire. Long before the 16th century, the Akan peoples had already begun migrating southward from the Sahel and Savannah regions, particularly from areas that today include parts of Mali and Burkina Faso. This movement, likely beginning in the 11th or 12th centuries, was not a single mass migration, but rather a gradual process that unfolded over generations. Driven by changing ecological conditions, trade opportunities, and internal disputes, various groups settled throughout the forest zones. These settlers formed small-scale polities, often centered around extended family clans and chieftaincies. Among the earliest of these states was Bono, sometimes called Bono Manso, located in the northern part of what is now central Ghana. By the 13th century, Bono had become an important regional center for trade, especially in gold. The state developed systems of governance, social structure, and religious practices that would later influence its Akan descendants. Bono also maintained trade relations with northern merchants linked to the trans-Saharan routes. Through these networks, goods such as salt, cloth, and metalware were exchanged for gold, kola nuts, and slaves from the forest regions. By the 14th century, the fame of West Africa's gold had already reached Europe and the Middle East. Arab geographers described the riches of the region, and European maps often marked the area with the Latin phrase aurum de Guinea, gold of Guinea. When the Portuguese arrived along the coast in the second half of the 15th century, they were not discovering an unknown land, but rather joining an already thriving network of commerce. They established trading posts, or feitorias, along the Gulf of Guinea, including Elmina in 1482, which would become a major hub for gold and, later, for the transatlantic slave trade. At this time, the southern forest belt of present-day Ghana was controlled not by a single power, but by multiple independent states. Among the most prominent were Denkyira, Akwamu, Twaifo, and the already declining Bono. Each had its own leadership, military structure, and economic interests. Denkyira in particular emerged as a dominant force by the late 16th century, controlling trade routes and demanding tribute from neighboring states. Its capital, Abankasiso, became a political and economic center. Through strategic warfare and alliances, Denkyira exerted influence over many smaller polities, including the future Ashanti clans. The Denkyira state was especially effective in leveraging access to European trade. By dominating routes leading from the forest interior to the coastal forts, Denkyira positioned itself as a gatekeeper. Goods from the Ashanti hinterlands, primarily gold and enslaved persons, passed through Denkyira hands before reaching European traders. In return, Denkyira elites acquired firearms, textiles, beads, and alcohol. This trade not only enriched Denkyira, but also shifted the balance of power in the region. Control over European goods became a source of both prestige and military advantage. The Fante Confederacy, located along the coast, also played a critical role during this period. Unlike Denkyira, the Fante were more decentralized but formed loose coalitions to protect their interests. They maintained close contact with European forts and actively mediated trade between the coast and the inland states. Sometimes rivals, sometimes collaborators with Denkyira, the Fante were skilled at navigating the growing European presence to their own advantage. Their seaports, including Anamabo and Mankesem, became key commercial sites. In the northern savannas, far beyond the tropical forests of the Akan states, other powerful polities such as Ganja, Dagbon, and Mossi also influenced the dynamics of the region. These states engaged in long-distance trade with both the Akan and the Islamic empires of the Sahel, such as Mali and Songhai. Goods such as leather, salt, and copper filtered south, while gold and slaves flowed north. This triangular interaction between savanna, forest, and coast helped define the broader economic ecosystem of West Africa. Religiously, the forest states, including the Akan, practiced traditional belief systems centered on ancestral spirits, sacred forests, and powerful deities. Every lineage traced its origins to a founding ancestor, whose spirit was thought to influence the welfare of the clan. Priests, diviners, and fetish priests played essential roles in guiding community decisions, mediating disputes, and conducting rituals. Spiritual legitimacy was closely tied to political authority. Chiefs were not only political leaders, but also custodians of the sacred. This fusion of religion and governance would later be central to the rise of the Ashanti. Socially, Akan societies were matrilineal, meaning inheritance and succession passed through the mother's line. This shaped clan organization, royal succession, and property rights. Women, particularly queen mothers, wielded considerable influence in political and domestic affairs. The queen mother often nominated or advised the chief and acted as a counterbalance to his authority. This gendered balance of power, though not equal in modern terms, was a distinctive feature of Akan political life. Meanwhile, the constant push for economic control and security led to frequent warfare among the states. Raids, territorial disputes, and efforts to control trade routes were common. This created a volatile environment in which only the most organized and militarized states could thrive. Armies composed of local warriors, often equipped with European firearms by the late 16th century, became essential tools of statecraft. Alliances were often short-lived, and shifting loyalties shaped the region's politics. In the heart of the dense West African forests, a small but steadily growing settlement called Kumasi began to emerge as a focal point for cultural, spiritual, and political development. It was here, in this fertile and strategic basin, that the Oyoko clan of the Akan people began a process of quiet consolidation, a movement that would one day culminate in the formation of the Ashanti Empire. The story of Kumasi and the Oyoko in the 17th century is not one of sudden conquest, but of calculated growth, spiritual guidance, and political ingenuity. The Oyoko clan, a branch of the broader Akan-speaking peoples, traced its lineage to the ancient Bono state to the north. Following pressures from rival states and opportunities for expansion, various Oyoko groups began migrating southward during the 15th and 16th centuries. Eventually, they settled in the forest zone of central Ghana. Among the settlements they established, Kumasi held particular promise due to its rich soil, abundant water, and central location between northern trade routes and southern forest resources. Kumasi was more than just well-positioned geographically. It was situated in a low-lying valley ringed by gently rising hills, offering both natural defense and fertile land. Surrounding it were other Akan-speaking communities, some of whom were independent, while others fell under the growing influence of Denkyira to the south. Unlike many other states that rose to power through swift military campaigns, the Oyoko in Kumasi focused on building internal stability and fostering strategic relationships with neighboring clans. The clan system played a central role in this early development. In Oyoko tradition, as with other Akan groups, social and political organization was rooted in the matrilineal lineage. The clan was more than just a family. It was a political unit, a religious community, and a social safety net. Leadership passed not from father to son, but through the maternal line, typically from an uncle to his sister's son. This system ensured that authority remained within the bloodline, while also balancing power between male rulers and female advisors, especially the influential queen mothers. At the center of Kumasi's political life was the chief, known as the Omanhene. This figure was not only a military and political leader, but also a spiritual figurehead responsible for maintaining harmony with the ancestors and the gods. His authority was not absolute. He was expected to consult with a council of elders and work in tandem with the Queen Mother. Decisions affecting the clan were reached through consensus and ritual observance, not mere command. One of the earliest known leaders of the Oyoko in Kumasi was Nana Oti Akenten. While detailed records of his reign are scarce, oral traditions preserved through Ashanti historians, known as Akyem, credit him with laying the foundations of what would become the Ashanti state. Nana Oti Akenten is remembered as a thoughtful and deliberate ruler, one who preferred diplomacy over confrontation. Under his leadership, Kumasi grew from a local village into a modest regional center, attracting traders, farmers, and artisans from across the central forest region. Nana Oti Akenten is particularly remembered for his successful negotiations with neighboring clans, especially the Agona, Aduana, and Bretuo. These alliances were not simply military pacts, they were reinforced through marriage, ritual cooperation, and shared festivals. This network of support helped Kumasi to maintain its independence from Denkyira domination, even as many other states in the region were brought under Denkyira's tributary system. An important moment in the rise of Kumasi came with the decision to build a central market. This development signaled both economic maturity and political ambition. The market attracted traders from across the region, including those from the savannah to the north and the Fante-dominated coastal regions to the south. Gold dust became the standard currency, and Kumasi's artisans developed a reputation for fine craftsmanship in gold jewelry, carved stools, and textiles. These economic developments would later support the creation of a professional army and administrative system. But for now, they marked Kumasi as a rising star in the region. The growing prestige of Kumasi also had a spiritual dimension. The Oyoko maintained close ties with traditional priests and spiritual advisors, whose role was central to community life. Sacred groves, ancestral shrines, and festivals dedicated to the gods and spirits became integral to the town's identity. It was during this period that the idea of sacred kingship began to take shape, a concept in which political authority was legitimized by spiritual sanction. This belief system would later be formalized through the myth of the Golden Stool, but even in these early years, the groundwork was being laid. As Kumasi's stature increased, so too did the challenges it faced. Denkyira, still the dominant power in the region, was aware of Kumasi's growing influence. While no direct military confrontation occurred during Nana Oti Akenten's time, Denkyira imposed economic pressures and attempted to draw Kumasi into its tributary network. Rather than confront Denkyira directly, the Oyoko leadership bided their time, strengthening their internal cohesion and deepening their regional alliances. One reason for their patience was a long-term vision. The Oyoko recognized that Denkyira's hold over the region, though powerful, was not unshakable. Many smaller states under Denkyira's control were resentful of the heavy tributes they were forced to pay, which included gold, slaves, and military levies. This discontent created a fertile ground for rebellion, if only a strong and united alternative power could emerge to lead it. In this atmosphere of quiet preparation, the Oyoko began to groom future leaders who could take the next step beyond consolidation and into outright state building. The most important of these was a young leader named Osei Tutu, who would eventually rise to become the first Asantehene, or king of the Ashanti. During his youth, Osei Tutu studied under powerful leaders, traveled to Denkyira as a political hostage, and later formed a lifelong partnership with the spiritual advisor Kamfo Anokie. These experiences would prepare him for the challenges ahead, but they were still in the future. By the closing years of the 17th century, the quiet rise of Kumasi had positioned the Oyoko clan as a regional force with growing political ambition. Under the careful leadership of figures like Nana Oti Akenten, the foundation had been laid. But it was the arrival of a single charismatic leader, Osei Tutu, who would transform this local chieftaincy into a rising empire. His reign marks a turning point not only in Ashanti history, but in the broader story of West Africa. Through political skill, military strategy, and spiritual innovation, Osei Tutu built the Ashanti Union and took the first bold steps toward empire. Osei Tutu's early life reflected the complexities of the region. Born into the royal Oyoko lineage in Kumasi, he was selected for leadership early in life but was sent as a political hostage to the court of Denkyira, the dominant power at the time. This was a common practice in West African diplomacy, used both to ensure loyalty and to expose young nobles to the political systems of rival states. While at the Denkyira court, Osei Tutu absorbed key lessons about power, military organization, and courtly intrigue. He also saw firsthand the resentment that Denkyira's harsh tributary demands stirred among its subject states. After his return to Kumasi, Osei Tutu began working to consolidate his authority within the Oyoko and to deepen alliances with other Akan clans. But his most important partnership came not with a military leader or a neighboring chief, but with a priest, Kamfo Anokie. This spiritual advisor, known for his wisdom and mystical authority, would play an essential role in the formation of the Ashanti identity. The collaboration between Osei Tutu and Kamfo Anokie combined political realism with spiritual legitimacy, a fusion that would become a hallmark of the Ashanti state. One of their first shared projects was to unify the disparate Akan clans into a political confederation. This was no easy task. The Akan peoples spoke similar dialects and shared many cultural traits, but they were divided into numerous independent states, each with its own rulers, rivalries, and customs. Osei Tutu and Kamfo Anokie approached this challenge with a mix of diplomacy, spiritual persuasion, and shared grievances against Denkyira. Their key insight was to offer an alternative to Denkyira's dominance. Rather than submitting to the exploitation of a distant overlord, the Akan states could form a voluntary union, led by Kumasi, that protected their sovereignty and advanced their common interests. Osei Tutu did not demand total submission. Instead, he invited the leaders of neighboring clans to participate in a new alliance, one that would share power while uniting under a single sovereign authority. The breakthrough came at a ceremonial gathering in Kumasi, where chiefs and elders from several Akan states, including the Agona, Bretuo, Adwana, and Asakiri, agreed to form a confederation. To seal this political union, Kamfo Anokie performed what would become the defining moment in Ashanti tradition, the summoning of the Golden Stool. According to oral tradition, Kamfo Anokie called down the Golden Stool from the heavens, and it descended gently into the lap of Osei Tutu. This stool, made not of wood or gold leaf, but entirely of solid spiritual energy, was said to house the soul, the sunsum, of the entire Ashanti nation. Its arrival symbolized the unity of the clans and the divine legitimacy of the new state. No person, not even the king, was permitted to sit on the stool. It was not a throne, but a sacred object, one that represented the people, their ancestors, and their collective future. With the Golden Stool as the spiritual foundation, the Ashanti Union was officially born. Osei Tutu was declared the first Asantehene, king of all Ashanti. However, his rule was not absolute. The confederation was organized in a way that allowed considerable autonomy to its member states. Each retained its local chief and council of elders, but pledged loyalty to the Asantehene and the Union. This structure balanced central authority with local identity, a political design that would prove remarkably resilient. To ensure cohesion, the new state also began to develop institutions that reflected both practical needs and spiritual values. A centralized army was created, composed of warriors from across the Union. Tribute systems were standardized, with gold and agricultural goods collected not as punishment, but as support for the shared defense and ceremonial life of the state. A court system was established in Kumasi, with the Asantehane's palace becoming both a legal and spiritual center. The Ashanti Union also began to formalize its oral laws and traditions through a cadre of trained spokesmen and advisors known as Akiami. These individuals were more than translators. They were legal scholars, diplomats, and interpreters of royal will. They helped mediate disputes between clans, preserved historical memory, and ensured that royal pronouncements aligned with traditional norms. Osei Tutu's leadership was central to the success of the Union. He was a skilled diplomat who understood that force alone could not secure lasting unity. His charisma, combined with Kamfo Anokye's spiritual authority, gave the Union both emotional and ideological strength. But he also knew that unity must be defended. Denkyira, watching these developments with growing alarm, was unlikely to allow its former vassals to unite freely. Indeed, by the first years of the 18th century, tensions between Denkyira and the Ashanti Union were escalating. Denkyira saw the Union as a direct threat to its regional dominance and attempted to reassert control through tribute demands and threats. Osei Tutu, recognizing the inevitability of conflict, began preparing his forces and solidifying internal alliances. He also used diplomacy to sway some of Denkyira's own tributary states, promising them greater autonomy and shared prosperity under Ashanti leadership. This period of preparation laid the groundwork for what would become the Ashanti's first major military test, the war against Denkyira. But even before battle was joined, the Ashanti had already achieved something remarkable. In just a few years, they had moved from a small regional polity to a unified confederation, bound together by shared rituals, political agreements, and a symbol, the Golden Stool, that transcended clan loyalties. By the opening years of the 18th century, the newly formed Ashanti Union stood at a critical juncture. Under the leadership of Osei Tutu and guided by the spiritual vision of Kamfo Anokye, the Union had brought together a collection of Akan states under a shared identity. However, political unity and ritual legitimacy were only part of the foundation of statehood. To survive and be taken seriously in the regional power structure, the Ashanti would have to confront their most immediate and powerful threat, Denkyira. At the time, Denkyira was not simply a neighbor. It was the dominant regional power, a military and economic force that had long controlled trade routes, demanded tributes, and imposed its will on smaller Akan states. The rise of the Ashanti Union directly challenged that order. Denkyira's leadership viewed the new confederation centered in Kumasi as a rebellion in the making, an alliance that had to be crushed before it could grow any stronger. For the Ashanti, the situation was equally urgent. Having successfully created a political union, Osei Tutu and his allies now faced the question of sovereignty. Could the Ashanti truly be free if they continued to pay tribute to Denkyira? Would their unity hold if they failed to defend themselves against external pressure? The coming conflict would answer these questions and shape the future of the entire region. Denkyira, led at the time by King Ntimgakari, believed that the Ashanti could be brought back into line with a show of force. Confident in their military superiority and long accustomed to the submission of lesser states, Denkyira mobilized its army and prepared to march on Kumasi. The message was clear: resistance would not be tolerated. Osei Tutu, however, had been preparing for this moment. For years, he had been quietly building an army composed of fighters from across the Ashanti Union. Drawing from the various member states, the army reflected the diversity and strength of the new confederation. It was more than a collection of warriors. It was a national force, trained, organized, and motivated by a common purpose. Kamfo Anokye, the spiritual advisor and co-founder of the Union, played a critical role in preparing the people for war. Through ritual ceremonies, blessings, and public speeches, he reinforced the idea that this was not merely a political conflict. It was a sacred duty. The survival of the Golden Stool, and thus the soul of the Ashanti nation, depended on their victory. Kamfo Anokye is said to have performed powerful rites to protect the Ashanti forces and even prophesied the outcome of the battle. The two armies met at the Battle of Fayase, a location not far from present-day Kumasi. The exact date of the battle is uncertain, but it is generally placed around the year 1701. What is known is that the confrontation was decisive. Despite Denkyira's numerical advantage and long-standing military reputation, the Ashanti forces, under the direct command of Osei Tutu, executed a well-planned and disciplined strategy. Ashanti oral traditions emphasize the strategic coordination that defined their victory. Osei Tutu divided his forces into multiple wings, using the forest terrain to their advantage. The Ashanti troops launched coordinated attacks that overwhelmed the Denkyira forces, who had grown overconfident and underestimated their opponents' resolve and organization. The most symbolic moment of the battle came when King Ntim Gyakari of Denkyira was captured and killed. His death not only broke the morale of his army, but also shattered the myth of Denkyira's invincibility. The once dominant kingdom was decisively defeated, and its political structure collapsed soon afterward. Many of its subject states either declared independence or joined the victorious Ashanti Union. The victory at Fayase was far more than a battlefield success. It marked the true beginning of the Ashanti Empire. No longer a regional alliance seeking to defend itself, the Ashanti now emerged as the leading power in the forest zone of West Africa. The defeat of Denkyira had both material and symbolic consequences. Materially, the Ashanti gained access to vital trade routes, especially those leading to the coast. With Denkyira no longer controlling the flow of goods, the Ashanti were able to trade directly with coastal states, and by extension, with European merchants operating from forts along the Gulf of Guinea. Gold, cola nuts, and slaves could now be exchanged without tribute or interference. This economic independence would fuel further growth and allow the Ashanti to develop administrative institutions, professionalize their military, and support cultural production. Symbolically, the victory reinforced the legitimacy of the Golden Stool and the role of the Asantehene as the spiritual and political leader of the nation. Osei Tutu's leadership was vindicated, and Kamfo Anokye's spiritual guidance was seen as instrumental to the triumph. The mythic and historical blended into a powerful national narrative that would be retold for generations. One of the immediate challenges following the victory was managing the new territories and populations brought into the Ashanti sphere. Osei Tutu and his advisors took a careful approach. They did not seek to erase the identities of conquered peoples, but instead incorporated them into the union through a system of allegiance, tribute, and mutual obligation. Local chiefs were often retained in their positions, provided they swore loyalty to the Asantehene and acknowledged the authority of the Golden Stool. This flexible and inclusive approach allowed the empire to expand without constant rebellion. Rather than a top-down imperial rule, the Ashanti developed a layered system of governance. The central authority in Kumasi coordinated military, judicial, and diplomatic affairs, while local matters were often left to the discretion of traditional leaders. This balance between unity and autonomy became one of the empire's defining strengths. The defeat of Denkyira also altered the regional political map. Neighboring states took note of the Ashanti's rising power and either sought alliances or prepared for future confrontations. Some, like the Akan and the Fante, remained wary of Ashanti intentions, while others saw opportunities in trade and cooperation. The coastal Europeans, especially the Dutch and the British, began to engage more directly with Ashanti traders and envoys, recognizing their new role as regional gatekeepers. Despite the triumph, Osei Tutu remained cautious. He understood that military victory was only the beginning. The real task was to build a sustainable empire, one that could manage its diversity, protect its economic interests, and maintain internal unity. Unfortunately, Osei Tutu would not live to see the full consolidation of the empire he had founded. With the death of Osei Tutu, the Ashanti Empire stood at a pivotal moment. The triumph over Denkyira had secured the Ashanti Union's independence and elevated Kumasi to regional prominence. Yet victory in war does not guarantee the longevity of an empire. The foundations laid by Osei Tutu, military strength, spiritual unity, and federated governance, required careful expansion and refinement. It was now the task of his successor, Opoku Ware I, to consolidate that foundation, transform the confederation into a structured state, and ensure that the Ashanti would not simply be remembered as victors, but as rulers. Opoku Ware I was Osei Tutu's nephew, rising to the position of Asantehene shortly after Osei Tutu's untimely death. Like his predecessor, he belonged to the Oyoko clan and shared the same vision for a unified and enduring Ashanti state. However, Opoku Ware's temperament and priorities differed. Where Osei Tutu had been primarily a military and spiritual unifier, Opoku Ware proved to be an exceptional administrator, lawgiver, and empire builder. His reign, which lasted through much of the mid-18th century, marked a period of remarkable transformation. One of Opoku Ware's primary goals was to centralize power more effectively in Kumasi. While the Ashanti Union had been successful in bringing various Akan states together, it remained a relatively loose federation. Member states retained significant autonomy, and while they recognized the Asanteheni's spiritual authority, they often managed their own affairs independently. This arrangement had been effective in unifying against Denkyira, but it posed long-term risks to cohesion. To address this, Opoku Ware restructured the political hierarchy. He began by redefining the roles and responsibilities of regional chiefs. Those who ruled member states were now officially titled Amanhene, and while they retained local authority, they were expected to report regularly to the Asanteheni's court in Kumasi. Their loyalty was reaffirmed through rituals, pledges, and symbols of submission, such as presenting tributes or participating in national festivals. This helped reinforce the perception of a centralized order without entirely dismantling traditional leadership. At the same time, Opoku Ware expanded the reach of Kumasi's bureaucracy. He established a more formal council of state, composed of elders, military commanders, spiritual advisors, and court officials. This body, often referred to as the Asante Manhiamu, became a key instrument of governance. It allowed for wider participation in decision-making, provided a venue for conflict resolution, and helped standardize laws and policies across the empire. Justice and administration were not the only areas of reform. Opoku Ware also paid careful attention to infrastructure. Understanding that an empire's strength depends on more than its army, he commissioned the construction and maintenance of roads that connected Kumasi to key regions within the empire. These roads, often maintained through communal labor systems, facilitated trade, military movement, and political communication. They also symbolized the growing integration of the empire's various regions. Under his leadership, Kumasi itself was transformed. The city expanded in both size and complexity, becoming not just the political capital but also the cultural and economic heart of the empire. New buildings, including palaces, shrines, and markets, were constructed using local materials and traditional architectural styles. Kumasi became home to artisans, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and cloth weavers, many of whom worked under guild-like systems regulated by the state. The city's layout reflected its function. Central areas reserved for political and spiritual institutions, while outer zones supported trade and residential life. Opoku Ware also introduced reforms to the military. Recognizing that future expansion and security required a well-organized force, he professionalized the army. Recruitment was systematized, ranks were formalized, and new units were trained in both traditional weaponry and, increasingly, the use of European firearms. The empire began to stockpile muskets and gunpowder acquired through trade with coastal merchants. In return, the Ashanti exported gold, kola nuts, and, increasingly, enslaved persons, a practice that would come to have profound consequences. While administration and military reforms were central to his reign, Opoku Ware also embarked on territorial expansion. His campaigns pushed the borders of the empire outward in nearly every direction. To the north, the Ashanti subjugated parts of the Bono region, extending their influence into the savanna zones that linked them to trade networks reaching all the way to the Sahel. To the east, they came into conflict with the Akiem and the Krobo, seeking to control important trade routes and secure their eastern frontier. In the west, the Ashanti advanced toward Guiaman and other neighboring states, establishing tributary relationships and installing loyal rulers. Each conquest was not only a military victory, but a political negotiation. Opoku Ware often used a combination of force and diplomacy to integrate new regions. In many cases, he allowed local rulers to retain their positions as long as they acknowledged Ashanti supremacy and paid regular tribute. This system of indirect rule reduced the risk of rebellion and helped maintain cultural continuity within the diverse empire. Perhaps one of the most lasting impacts of his reign was his contribution to the Ashanti legal system. Oral tradition holds that Opoku Ware helped codify customary laws, creating clearer guidelines for marriage, inheritance, land ownership, and criminal justice. While these laws were still passed down orally, their consistency and standardization helped unify the empire. The Akyem, or royal spokesman, played a central role in interpreting and transmitting these laws, acting as both judges and legal historians. Religion continued to play a vital role in governance. While Kamfo Anokye no longer held active power during this period, the institutions he helped shape, particularly the reverence for the Golden Stool and the spiritual legitimacy of the Asantehene, remained central. Opoku Ware maintained strong relations with priests, oracles, and spiritual custodians across the empire. Ritual festivals such as the Adai were used not only for spiritual renewal, but also for political reaffirmation. These events brought leaders from across the empire to Kumasi, reinforcing unity and allowing the central court to display its wealth, power, and order. Despite his many achievements, Opoku Ware's reign was not without challenges. Internal dissent occasionally flared, especially in regions where local chiefs felt threatened by Kumasi's growing influence. External threats also persisted, particularly from eastern neighbors who feared Ashanti encroachment. Still, through a combination of strategic marriages, military pressure, and economic incentives, Opoku Ware managed to maintain control and even expand the empire's reach. As the Ashanti Empire moved from consolidation to expansion under the leadership of Opoku Ware I, its ambitions began to stretch beyond the forested heartlands of the Akan peoples. The empire's growing administrative capacity, strengthened military, and centralized governance had positioned it as a formidable force in the region. But to secure long-term prosperity and political influence, the Ashanti needed more than internal unity. They needed strategic access to trade routes, new sources of wealth, and regional dominance. These aims drew their attention northward toward the Bono and Ganja regions. The northern frontier of the Ashanti realm marked a significant geographic and cultural transition. The dense, humid forests of the south gradually gave way to the drier savannas of central West Africa. This zone was more than a borderland. It was a vital corridor connecting the forested south to the trans-Saharan trade routes that linked West Africa to North Africa and the wider Islamic world. Controlling these territories meant controlling trade in gold, kola nuts, leather, salt, and, increasingly, enslaved persons. Among the most prominent political entities in this northern region was the Bono state, often referred to as Bono Manso. Historically, Bono Manso had played a crucial role in early Akan civilization. In earlier centuries, it had been a thriving trade and political center. It was from Bono and its neighboring states that the ancestors of the Ashanti, including the Oyoko clan, had originally migrated southward. By the early 18th century, however, Bono Manso had declined in both political cohesion and military strength. Internal divisions and external pressures had weakened its ability to maintain independence. For the Ashanti, the region offered both an opportunity and a challenge. On the one hand, it represented a symbolic return to ancestral lands and a practical move to capture long-distance trade. On the other hand, Bono Manso still retained local authority, fortified settlements, and a complex network of alliances that would not be easy to subdue. Opoku Ware I launched a series of calculated campaigns to bring Bono under Ashanti control. These military expeditions were marked by strategic planning and a combination of warfare, negotiation, and integration. Instead of pursuing wholesale destruction, the Ashanti focused on defeating resistance, removing uncooperative rulers, and installing leaders loyal to Kumasi. Local populations were often spared and their customs respected, provided they pledged allegiance to the Golden Stool and the Asantehene. The defeat of Bono Manso expanded the Ashanti's northern frontier and opened up trade access that had long been controlled by intermediaries. Ashanti merchants could now deal more directly with Muslim traders from the Sahel and beyond. This brought not only goods such as salt and horses, but also new cultural influences, including exposure to Islamic scholarship, writing, and architecture. As the Ashanti continued to expand, their attention turned further north and slightly to the west toward the powerful state of Ganja. Unlike Bono Manso, the Ganja kingdom had not experienced the same degree of political decline. Founded in the early 17th century, Ganja had grown into a prosperous and militarily capable state. It had strong connections to Islamic trade networks and was ruled by a centralized monarchy that posed a real challenge to Ashanti expansion. The Ashanti and Gonja clashed over control of trade routes, especially those connecting to markets in Buna, Bego, and Salaga. These cities were major hubs where northern goods like salt, textiles, and livestock met southern products such as gold, ivory, and kola nuts. Salaga, in particular, was known as the Timbuktu of the South for its significance in regional commerce. The Ashanti recognized that access to such cities would strengthen their economic position and extend their diplomatic reach. Military campaigns against Ganja required careful preparation. The Ashanti army, though highly disciplined, was more accustomed to forest warfare. Fighting in the savannah meant adjusting tactics and logistics. Nonetheless, the Ashanti forces, under the continued guidance of Opoku Ware and his generals, managed to adapt effectively. Their muskets, acquired through coastal trade, gave them a technological edge in many confrontations. Rather than attempt to conquer the entire Ganja kingdom outright, the Ashanti focused on controlling key towns and trade corridors. They engaged in a series of confrontations, sieges, and negotiations that allowed them to establish influence without occupying the entire territory. Local rulers who cooperated were allowed to retain authority under Ashanti oversight. Those who resisted were removed or reduced to tributary status. Through these efforts, the Ashanti began to dominate much of the trade flowing through the north-central region of what is now Ghana. Gold from the south could now travel northward along secure routes under Ashanti control. In return, goods from northern traders, especially salt, a vital commodity for preserving food, flowed south into Ashanti markets. The expansion into Bono and Ganja also had religious and cultural implications. As Ashanti soldiers and merchants encountered Muslim communities, they were introduced to new religious practices, Arabic script, and Islamic education. While Islam did not replace traditional Ashanti spiritual beliefs, some Ashanti leaders began to appreciate the utility of written communication and Islamic scholarship in diplomacy and record-keeping. This cultural exchange did not result in mass conversion, but it enriched the empire's intellectual landscape. Politically, the northern expansion enhanced the prestige of the Asantehene. Opoku Ware was no longer just the unifier of Akan clans or the conqueror of Denkyira. He was now the master of a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire that stretched from the forested interior to the edge of the savannah. His court in Kumasi grew more diverse, hosting envoys, merchants, and emissaries from across West Africa. The annual festivals and durbars became even grander, showcasing not only Ashanti wealth but also its newly extended reach. The control of Bono and Ganja also brought new administrative challenges. The Ashanti had to manage regions that were culturally distinct from the core Akan areas. To address this, they continued to refine their indirect rule strategy. Rather than imposing Ashanti chiefs, they often confirmed local rulers who agreed to act as vassals. Tribute systems were adjusted to reflect local economic conditions, and Ashanti officials were sent to monitor compliance without directly replacing existing governance structures. This pragmatic approach helped the Ashanti maintain control without inciting widespread rebellion. However, it also required ongoing diplomatic effort. The empire's success depended not only on military victories but on its ability to manage loyalty, resolve disputes, and balance competing interests within its growing domain. As the Ashanti Empire expanded in the 18th century, its strength was not sustained by military might alone. Behind the empire's growing power was a vibrant, complex, and dynamic economy. Anchored by abundant natural resources, Driven by skilled labor and interwoven with local and international trade networks, the Ashanti economy served as the foundation upon which its political and military ambitions were built. Gold, the transatlantic slave trade, and the cultural production of kente cloth were central to this system, each playing a unique role in shaping the identity, wealth, and influence of the empire. Gold was the lifeblood of the Ashanti economy. The forested regions of central and southern Ghana were among the richest gold-producing areas in pre-colonial Africa. Long before the rise of the Ashanti, local peoples had been panning and mining for gold along riverbeds and in underground shafts. By the time the Ashanti Empire emerged as a dominant power in the early 18th century, gold was already deeply embedded in the region's economy, social customs, and spiritual life. What distinguished the Ashanti from earlier gold trading states was their ability to organize gold production and control its distribution on a large scale. Gold mining was typically carried out by local communities, with laborers working small plots, often during the dry season when farming was less demanding. While there were no massive state-run mines, the Ashanti monarchy ensured that a portion of all gold extracted within the empire was collected as royal tribute. This gold helped finance the Asantehene's court, pay soldiers, reward loyal chiefs, and support public ceremonies. The royal treasury in Kumasi grew rich with gold dust and ornaments. Gold was not only a medium of exchange, it was also a marker of status and a tool of diplomacy. Elaborate gold regalia, including bracelets, anklets, staffs, and the iconic gold weights used for measuring, adorned the nobility and symbolized their rank. Ashanti goldsmiths, renowned for their craftsmanship, produced intricate designs that blended artistic skill with spiritual symbolism. These objects were not merely decorative, they conveyed power, authority, and ancestral connection. Beyond internal wealth, gold connected the Ashanti Empire to global trade. Merchants from the north brought salt, leather, and textiles in exchange for gold. To the south, European traders along the Gulf of Guinea, particularly the Dutch, British, and Danes, eagerly exchanged firearms, cloth, and alcohol for the precious metal. The coastal forts, such as Elmina and Cape Coast, became key points of transaction. The Ashanti, through their growing control of trade routes, often negotiated indirectly with European traders using intermediary coastal peoples like the Fante. This allowed them to manage trade strategically without direct European interference in their internal affairs. While gold was the most prestigious economic asset, the transatlantic slave trade played a significant and deeply troubling role in the Ashanti economy. As European demand for enslaved Africans intensified during the 17th and 18th centuries, West African states adapted their political and military strategies to participate in this brutal trade. The Ashanti were no exception. Although the empire did not rely solely on the slave trade for its wealth, it became a major supplier of captives during periods of war and expansion. The majority of enslaved individuals traded by the Ashanti were war captives taken during military campaigns in neighboring regions. Rather than killing enemy fighters or rebellious subjects, Ashanti generals often captured and transported them to the south, where they were sold to European merchants in exchange for goods. These enslaved people were then shipped across the Atlantic to plantations in the Americas, particularly in the Caribbean and Brazil. This system created a cycle in which military victories fueled the economy, and in turn, the economy financed further military campaigns. The weapons acquired through the slave trade, especially muskets and gunpowder, gave the Ashanti army a technological edge over many of their neighbors, reinforcing their dominance in the region. It is important to recognize that not all enslaved individuals were exported. Within the Ashanti Empire itself, slavery existed in multiple forms. Some enslaved people were absorbed into households and could eventually gain status through loyal service. Others worked in agriculture, domestic labor, or artisanal trades. While Ashanti society distinguished between different categories of servitude, and some individuals could be integrated into the community over time, the underlying system was still based on coercion and lack of freedom. The Ashanti participation in the slave trade remains a deeply complex and painful part of their history. It reflects the entanglement of African states in a global system of exploitation and the moral ambiguities that accompanied economic and political survival in an era shaped by European colonial and commercial pressures. Alongside gold and the slave trade, the production of kente cloth became a defining feature of the Ashanti economy and cultural identity. Kente is a brightly colored, intricately woven textile made from silk and cotton threads. Each pattern, or ntoma, carries a specific meaning, often related to proverbs, historical events, or social values. The origins of kente weaving are traced to the town of Bonwire in the Ashanti region, where master weavers developed techniques that blended traditional Akan patterns with influences from Northern and Islamic weaving styles. Kente cloth held immense cultural significance. It was worn during ceremonies, festivals, and official gatherings. Only royalty and high-ranking officials were permitted to wear certain types of kente, and the selection of a pattern was often a political statement. The cloth symbolized unity, history, and the aesthetic sophistication of Ashanti culture. As the empire grew in wealth and stature, kente production expanded, with weavers becoming respected artisans and the cloth becoming a valuable commodity in regional trade. Economically, kente weaving created a robust artisanal sector. Entire communities specialized in spinning, dyeing, and weaving. These crafts were passed down through generations, and workshops operated under guild-like structures with apprentices and master weavers. Kente became not only a product of cultural pride, but also a source of livelihood for many within the empire. The Ashanti economic model, therefore, was not monolithic. It rested on a diverse foundation that included mining, agriculture, trade, crafts, and forced labor. The state maintained a degree of oversight, but allowed space for local enterprise. Tribute and taxation helped sustain the central authority, while regional markets and long-distance trade routes connected the empire to neighboring polities and foreign merchants. Kumasi, the capital, became the epicenter of economic activity. Its markets bustled with traders offering everything from food and livestock to textiles, metals, and beads. Merchants from across West Africa traveled to Kumasi to buy and sell, and the city became known for both its commercial scale and regulatory order. Prices were negotiated with the help of gold weights and scales, and trade disputes were settled by officials trained in customary law. As the Ashanti Empire extended its reach across the forest and savanna zones of West Africa, its next logical focus turned southward, toward the Atlantic coast. The promise of direct access to European trade goods, particularly firearms, cloth, and metal tools, made the southern frontier an area of significant strategic interest. Yet between the Ashanti heartland and the coastal forts controlled by European powers lay a formidable obstacle: the Fante Confederacy. The Fante, like the Ashanti, were Akan-speaking people, but they had long developed their own political and commercial structures along the coast of what is today southern Ghana. Organized into a loose confederation of independent towns, such as Mankesum, Anomabo, and Abora, the Fante occupied a narrow but critically important stretch of territory along the Gulf of Guinea. From this position, they became intermediaries in the growing trade between the African interior and European merchants stationed in coastal forts, including those controlled by the British, Dutch, and Danes. The Fante states were not a single unified kingdom, but they operated with a high degree of coordination when their common interests were at stake. The Confederacy maintained a council of chiefs and mobilized joint military forces when necessary, particularly in times of external threat. Their wealth and influence stemmed largely from their control of trade. Goods from the inland regions, gold, slaves, kola nuts, ivory, had to pass through Fante territory before reaching European markets, and vice versa. This positioning allowed the Fante to act as brokers and regulators, levying taxes and controlling the flow of goods. For the Ashanti, this arrangement became increasingly frustrating. Despite their military dominance inland, the empire lacked direct access to the European forts. Trade with Europeans was therefore mediated by the Fante, who not only marked up prices, but also limited the types and quantities of goods that reached the Ashanti. The Asantehene and his advisors recognized that continued dependence on Fante middlemen would restrict their economic sovereignty and weaken their to negotiate with foreign powers. Tensions between the Ashanti and the Fante began to escalate in the late 18th century, particularly as the Ashanti sought to assert greater control over southern trade routes. Skirmishes occasionally erupted along caravan paths, and both sides engaged in diplomatic maneuvering to strengthen their respective positions. The Ashanti sent emissaries to coastal forts in an attempt to establish direct relations with European merchants, while the Fante reinforced their own alliances, especially with the British. Despite these rivalries, the relationship between the Ashanti and the Fante was not purely hostile. There were long periods of coexistence and cooperation, especially when mutual interests aligned. For instance, both polities benefited from the trade in gold and slaves. During times of relative peace, Ashanti goods flowed south to Fante markets and ports, and in return, the empire received imported firearms, gunpowder, European cloth, and alcohol. Marriage alliances, shared religious festivals, and cultural exchange helped to smooth relations, even as political tensions simmered. As Akan-speaking peoples, the Ashanti and the Fante shared many customs, beliefs, and social structures. Chiefs from both societies consulted oracles, held similar festivals like the Adai, and practiced matrilineal inheritance. These shared elements often served as points of negotiation, allowing for diplomatic channels even in moments of confrontation. However, as the Ashanti Empire grew more assertive in the early 19th century, the pressure to bypass the Fante entirely intensified. The Ashanti leadership viewed coastal access as not just an economic necessity, but a matter of national dignity and imperial strategy. Their growing strength inland had little meaning if they remained dependent on coastal intermediaries. The Fante, for their part, increasingly saw Ashanti ambitions as a direct threat to their autonomy and economic survival. To counterbalance Ashanti pressure, the Fante turned to European allies, particularly the British. The British, eager to maintain favorable trading conditions and wary of a powerful inland empire gaining direct access to the coast, found it advantageous to support the Fante in various ways, including arms shipments and political recognition. This triangle, Ashanti, Fante, and European powers, created a volatile geopolitical environment. The Ashanti knew that any attempt to move militarily against the Fante would not only provoke regional resistance, but might also trigger a European response. The Fante, on the other hand, were aware that their survival depended increasingly on the strength of their foreign alliances, especially as internal unity within the Confederacy was often fragile. Despite their differences, the Fante and Ashanti maintained commercial ties throughout much of this period. Traders on both sides often worked pragmatically, adapting to shifting political winds. Smuggling and unofficial trade channels flourished, especially when open conflict was too costly for either side. In many cases, local merchants prioritized profit over loyalty to central authorities, further complicating the relationship between the two polities. A key example of Ashanti attempts to bypass the Fante came during the reign of Asantehene Osei Bonsu, who ruled during the early 19th century. Recognizing the strategic necessity of reaching the coast, Osei Bonsu launched a series of military campaigns aimed at securing southern access. These efforts brought the Ashanti into direct conflict with Fante states and eventually drew the attention of the British. Though some military victories were achieved, the Ashanti were never able to fully subdue the Fante or gain consistent, unmediated access to the coastal forts. British resistance, combined with local opposition, ensured that the southern frontier remained contested ground. Nonetheless, the repeated clashes with the Fante exposed the weaknesses of the Confederacy and highlighted the shifting balance of power on the Gold Coast. The Ashanti-Fante relationship illustrates the complexity of regional politics in pre-colonial West Africa. It was not a simple matter of imperial conquest or tribal rivalry, but rather a long-standing strategic contest between two sophisticated political entities. Both adapted to external pressures, used diplomacy and war in measured ways, and navigated the growing influence of European powers on African soil. As the Ashanti Empire expanded its territory and strengthened its internal systems, its gaze increasingly turned southward, not just toward the coastal African states like the Fante, but toward the European presence that had been steadily growing along the Gulf of Guinea. Long before the Ashanti emerged as a centralized power, European nations had already established trading posts and fortified structures known as forts along the coast of West Africa. These European enclaves, built by the Portuguese, Dutch, British, Danes, and others, played a crucial role in shaping the commercial and political environment of the region. By the early 18th century, when the Ashanti began to assert themselves in regional affairs, the coastal strip had already become one of the most commercially dynamic zones in the Atlantic world. European interest in the region was driven by gold, slaves, ivory, and later palm oil. The forts served as secure bases from which European merchants could conduct trade, negotiate with local leaders, and protect their interests from both African rivals and European competitors. The Dutch were among the earliest and most influential European powers on the Gold Coast. They seized Elmina Castle from the Portuguese in the early 17th century and made it their headquarters. Elmina, strategically located and heavily fortified, quickly became the central node of Dutch operations in West Africa. The Dutch West India Company controlled the fort and established a network of smaller outposts along the coast. From these bases, Dutch merchants traded with a range of African partners, including the Fante, Akwamu, and, eventually, the Ashanti. The British, too, sought a foothold on the coast. They established Cape Coast Castle, not far from Elmina, and began competing with the Dutch for access to African goods. The British Royal African Company and later independent traders brought textiles, firearms, metal goods, and spirits in exchange for gold and slaves. Over time, the British would expand their presence, building additional forts and cultivating alliances with coastal states, particularly the Fante Confederacy. The Danes, though less prominent than the Dutch or British, also established trading posts, including Fort Christiansborg at Osu, near present-day Accra. They conducted trade on a smaller scale, focusing on gold and slaves, and occasionally served as intermediaries between larger powers. While their influence was more limited, their forts and treaties added another layer of complexity to the coastal political scene. The Ashanti were well aware of these European enclaves and the power dynamics surrounding them. Though their territory did not initially extend to the coast, Ashanti rulers monitored coastal developments closely. They understood that controlling access to European trade goods, especially firearms, was essential for maintaining military superiority and regional influence. Yet they also recognized that direct confrontation with the European powers would be risky, especially without secure access to a seaport. Instead of engaging directly, early Ashanti kings relied on diplomacy and strategic trade relationships. Ashanti goods were typically transported south by caravan through intermediary traders, often Fante, Asin, or Akiem, who carried gold, slaves, and kola nuts to the coastal forts and returned with European goods. While this system allowed the Ashanti to participate in Atlantic commerce, it also left them vulnerable to price manipulation and political interference by coastal middlemen. To address this, the Ashanti sought to bypass these intermediaries. They sent diplomatic envoys to coastal forts, particularly those operated by the Dutch and British. These missions were designed to establish direct trade relations, negotiate favorable terms, and explore the possibility of formal alliances. One notable early mission involved the presentation of gold dust tributes and symbolic gifts, signaling the Ashanti's interest in formal relations and mutual respect. The Dutch, in particular, were receptive to Ashanti overtures. Elmina's proximity to key inland trade routes made it a natural partner for the Ashanti. Over time, a strong relationship developed, based on mutual economic interests. Dutch merchants gained steady access to high-quality Ashanti gold, while the Ashanti received European firearms, gunpowder, cloth, and luxury goods. This partnership strengthened the Ashanti militarily and allowed them to maintain a degree of independence in their dealings with other coastal powers. The British, meanwhile, remained cautious. Their alliance with the Fante placed them in an awkward position, as Ashanti ambitions often clashed with Fante interests. While British traders welcomed Ashanti gold and recognized the value of engaging with the empire, they were wary of disrupting their existing coastal partnerships. As a result, British-Ashanti relations during the 18th century remained cordial but limited, punctuated by trade, occasional diplomacy, and underlying tension. Danish relations with the Ashanti were less consistent. While some trade did occur, the Danes lacked the military and commercial scale of the Dutch or British and played a more secondary role in Ashanti European affairs. However, Danish forts occasionally served as neutral grounds for diplomacy or emergency trade when other routes were compromised. Despite the growing interaction, the Ashanti remained careful not to allow European influence to penetrate their internal affairs. Kumasi maintained tight control over foreign access to the empire's interior. European traders and missionaries were rarely permitted to travel beyond the southern borderlands. This deliberate isolation helped preserve Ashanti sovereignty and cultural autonomy, even as the empire engaged in global trade. The Ashanti also developed their own methods of intelligence gathering. Through their trade networks, they received information about European rivalries, coastal politics, and shifting alliances. This knowledge allowed the Asantehene and his council to adapt their strategies, sometimes playing one European power against another to gain better trade terms or to apply pressure on coastal intermediaries. One of the more subtle effects of European contact was the introduction of new goods and cultural influences into Ashanti society. European textiles, glass beads, tobacco, and metal tools became increasingly common in markets and households. Some Ashanti elites adopted aspects of European dress or incorporated foreign goods into ceremonial life. Yet these changes did not represent cultural surrender. Instead, they reflected a selective adaptation, an empire confident enough in its identity to incorporate useful innovations without compromising its core traditions. The growing presence of European forts along the coast also influenced Ashanti's strategic thinking. The empire's leaders understood that these stone-built structures were more than trading posts. They were footholds of foreign power. The Ashanti developed contingency plans for dealing with European interference, including military responses, economic pressure through trade embargoes, and coordinated diplomacy. As the Ashanti Empire entered the opening decades of the 19th century, it stood as one of the most formidable and organized powers in West Africa. The internal reforms of Osei Tutu and Opoku Ware I had created a centralized system of governance, a professional army, and a sophisticated economy. The empire had extended its authority across vast swaths of the forest and savanna, establishing indirect rule over multiple ethnic groups and consolidating control of key trade routes. But one challenge remained unresolved: access to the Atlantic coast. The Fante Confederacy continued to dominate the southern corridor between the Ashanti heartland and the European forts. This network of coastal towns, each with its own chief but united in a loose confederation, stood as both a gateway and a barrier to the European trade that the Ashanti coveted. The Fante maintained strong alliances with the British and other European powers, using these relationships to bolster their military and political position. For the Ashanti, whose ambitions now required full access to coastal trade, this arrangement had become intolerable. It was under the leadership of Asantehene Osei Bonsu that the Ashanti launched a decisive campaign to break the Fante hold on southern trade. Osei Bonsu, who ruled during the early 19th century, is remembered as one of the most energetic and militarily astute leaders in Ashanti history. His reign was marked by significant expansion, reform, and confrontation, particularly with the Fante and their European allies. Osei Bonsu inherited a kingdom that was already militarily powerful, but he sought to push its boundaries further. Aware of the limitations posed by Ashanti dependence on coastal intermediaries, he made it a strategic priority to secure a direct path to the sea. His government began reorganizing the military, fortifying supply lines and cultivating support among southern border towns that had grown disillusioned with Fante dominance. The Fante, aware of growing Ashanti preparations, responded by strengthening their alliances with the British. British merchants and officials at Cape Coast Castle viewed the Ashanti advance with suspicion. While they traded profitably with Ashanti gold caravans, they were also committed to protecting Fante interests, which served as both a buffer against Ashanti expansion and as reliable commercial partners. Tensions boiled over into open conflict in the early years of Osei Bonsu's reign. The exact spark for war remains debated among historians, but it was likely a combination of trade disputes, territorial provocations, and political maneuvering. The Ashanti accused the Fante of disrupting trade and of harboring rebel chiefs who refused to acknowledge Ashanti authority. The Fante, for their part, accused the Ashanti of attempting to subjugate independent states by force. Osei Bonsu's military campaign against the Fante was methodically planned. The Ashanti army, renowned for its discipline and battlefield coordination, marched south in well-organized divisions. These forces carried muskets acquired through earlier trade with the Dutch and Danes, along with traditional weapons such as spears, swords, and bows. Support units followed, tasked with maintaining supply lines and securing occupied territories. As the Ashanti advanced into Fante territory, several key towns were attacked and captured. The campaign was marked by both swift battlefield victories and prolonged sieges. Towns that surrendered were often spared. Their leaders offered terms in exchange for loyalty to the Ashanti state. Those that resisted faced destruction. The Ashanti demonstrated both military prowess and strategic restraint, aiming not just to defeat the Fante militarily, but to incorporate their lands into a sustainable imperial order. The British role in the conflict remained cautious but impactful. Although they did not commit full military forces to the defense of the Fante, British agents provided arms and logistical support. British observers at the time expressed concern over the rising power of the Ashanti, fearing that a direct Ashanti presence on the coast could weaken British influence and commercial control. Nonetheless, they avoided direct engagement, unwilling to risk a full-scale war with a powerful inland empire. One of the most significant engagements during the conflict occurred near the coastal town of Anomabo, where Ashanti forces clashed with a coalition of Fante fighters and local allies. The battle, though fiercely contested, ended in an Ashanti victory. The town was not entirely destroyed, but it was brought under Ashanti authority. This victory gave the Ashanti access to trade routes just miles from the European forts, particularly those under British control. Despite these military gains, the Ashanti campaign faced logistical difficulties. The forest terrain became more challenging closer to the coast, especially during the rainy season. Moreover, the deeper the Ashanti army pushed into enemy territory, the more difficult it became to maintain supply lines and communication with Kumasi. Fante resistance, though weakened, continued through ambushes, counterattacks, and guerrilla tactics. The result was a military stalemate of sorts. The Ashanti had achieved significant victories and expanded their sphere of influence into the southern regions, but they fell short of fully breaking the Fante Confederacy or securing uncontested control of the coast. European forts, particularly those held by the British, remained outside Ashanti jurisdiction. Trade continued, but still through intermediaries, albeit now under greater Ashanti oversight. Osei Bonsu returned to Kumasi hailed as a triumphant military leader. His campaign had succeeded in weakening the Fante position and securing vital trade routes, even if the ultimate prize, unmediated access to the Atlantic, remained elusive. The conflict also sent a clear message to both African and European observers. The Ashanti were willing and able to defend their interests through both diplomacy and force. Following the war, Osei Bonsu focused on internal consolidation. Newly occupied territories were integrated into the empire's administrative system. Local rulers were either replaced or converted into loyal vassals. Tribute collection was reorganized, and Ashanti officials were stationed in key towns to monitor compliance. This process reinforced the Ashanti model of indirect rule, flexible enough to accommodate diverse cultures, but firm in its insistence on loyalty to the Golden Stool and the Asantehene. The war against the Fante also had long-term consequences for the empire's international posture. Ashanti leaders recognized that future confrontations with European powers were increasingly likely. The British, though cautious during the conflict, had shown their willingness to support coastal allies when their interests were threatened. The Ashanti would now have to navigate an even more delicate balance between asserting regional dominance and avoiding direct colonial confrontation. In the aftermath of the southern campaigns led by Asantehene Osei Bonsu, the Ashanti Empire found itself at the peak of its territorial and military influence. Yet, as is often the case in powerful empires, the most dangerous challenges came not only from external enemies, but also from within. In the decades following Osei Bonsu's death, the Ashanti state was confronted by a period of civil strife, succession disputes, and internal fragmentation. At the same time, important reforms emerged during these years. Reforms that would reshape the administrative, legal, and social structures of the empire. The first signs of instability appeared shortly after the passing of Osei Bonsu. His death left a leadership vacuum that set off a contested succession process. Ashanti political tradition, based on matrilineal inheritance, required the selection of a new Asantehene from the royal Oyoko clan, with strong input from the Queen Mother and the Council of Elders. However, rival factions within the royal family vied for power, each promoting different candidates and claiming legitimacy based on competing interpretations of lineage and merit. These tensions eventually culminated in the selection of Osei Akoto as Asantehene in the early decades of the 19th century. Although he came to power through the formal channels of Ashanti political culture, his reign was immediately marked by controversy. Osei Akoto inherited a kingdom that was militarily victorious but politically fractured. The cost of constant warfare had exhausted some regions, and the integration of new territories had created friction between older elites and recently appointed provincial administrators. Moreover, the Ashanti Empire was becoming increasingly diverse. As it expanded through conquest and diplomacy, it absorbed ethnic groups with different languages, customs, and political traditions. While the Ashanti had long managed a multi-ethnic society through indirect rule and pragmatic power sharing, these arrangements were now being tested by rising tensions and competing claims to authority in outlying regions. During Osei Akoto's reign, a series of internal uprisings and challenges to central authority emerged. Some provincial chiefs resisted demands for tribute or military service. Others refused to send delegates to Kumasi for imperial councils. In several cases, local leaders claimed greater autonomy, asserting that their loyalty to the empire did not require submission to Kumasi's increasingly centralized rule. In response to these developments, Osei Akoto launched a campaign to reassert royal authority. He dispatched military expeditions to rebellious regions, removed disloyal chiefs, and reorganized local governance structures. In some areas, Ashanti governors, known as Akyempimhene or kings in the field, were installed to directly oversee administration. This shift marked a move toward more centralized control, breaking with earlier patterns of looser federation. Yet this centralization was not without its critics. Many in the royal court and the provinces viewed Osei Akoto's reforms as heavy-handed and contrary to the spirit of consensus that had previously characterized Ashanti governance. Court politics grew increasingly tense, with rival factions accusing the king of undermining traditional checks and balances. Disputes arose not only over political power, but also over control of resources, particularly access to gold revenues, trade privileges, and appointments to key offices. These divisions occasionally broke out into open violence. Armed confrontations between rival factions occurred within Kumasi itself. Elsewhere in the empire, local power struggles were often framed as loyalty or disloyalty to the Golden Stool, the spiritual symbol of Ashanti unity. In reality, These struggles often revolved around deeper questions of identity, belonging, and the limits of central authority in a diverse and growing empire. Despite these challenges, the early 19th century also witnessed significant developments in statecraft and legal reform. One of the most enduring contributions of this period was the further formalization of the Ashanti legal system. While customary law had always been an integral part of Ashanti society, it now became more structured and codified, especially in the capital and major administrative centers. The royal court in Kumasi became a hub for legal interpretation and dispute resolution. The Asante Manhiamu, or National Council, heard cases involving land disputes, inheritance claims, and political grievances. The Akyem, or royal linguists and advisors, played a key role in these proceedings. Their deep knowledge of precedent and proverb-based law allowed them to render judgments that balanced tradition with practical governance. New categories of offenses were also more clearly defined during this period. Theft, adultery, witchcraft accusations, and breaches of military duty were increasingly standardized in terms of punishment. While execution remained a legal penalty in serious cases, the empire increasingly relied on fines, public shaming, exile, or ritual purification to maintain order. This reflected a growing recognition that social cohesion was better preserved through rehabilitation and reintegration than through severe punishment alone. Another area of reform involved military organization. The prolonged conflicts of the previous decades had revealed both the strengths and limitations of the Ashanti army. While highly capable in large-scale warfare, the empire now needed a more adaptable force to deal with internal unrest, banditry, and border skirmishes. In response, the military was restructured into smaller, more mobile units, each assigned to different regions with specific mandates. These units operated under regional commanders who reported directly to the Asantehene and the War Council in Kumasi. To support this military restructuring, changes were made to the empire's taxation and tribute systems. Rather than relying solely on periodic tribute from subject states, the central government introduced more regularized forms of tax collection. Regional officials were tasked with gathering revenues in gold dust, livestock, agricultural produce, and manpower. In return, these officials were expected to maintain peace, support imperial ceremonies, and contribute to the defense of the realm. This period also saw important shifts in Ashanti social and economic life. Urbanization increased, especially in Kumasi, which continued to grow as a political and commercial capital. Artisans, traders, and laborers migrated to the city, drawn by the promise of opportunity and imperial patronage. Marketplaces expanded, guilds became more organized, and new forms of apprenticeship and trade specialization emerged. Cultural production flourished as well. Kente weaving reached new heights of complexity and prestige, with different patterns now signifying political allegiance, regional origin, or social rank. Ashanti brass casting, goldsmithing, and woodcarving continued to produce ceremonial regalia, stools, and drums that expressed both aesthetic beauty and political authority. Music and dance played central roles in royal events, legal proceedings, and military ceremonies, reinforcing shared identity through performance and symbolism. In religious life, traditional practices remained dominant, though the empire's increasing contact with Muslim traders and emissaries introduced new ideas. Islamic influence was visible in the use of Arabic writing for record-keeping and in some elite circles interested in literacy and foreign diplomacy. However, Islam did not significantly penetrate Ashanti spiritual practice, which continued to revolve around ancestor veneration, sacred groves, and the powerful rituals surrounding the Golden Stool. One of the most remarkable features of this period was the empire's resilience. Despite internal unrest and the pressures of imperial overstretch, the Ashanti did not collapse. Instead, they adapted. Through a mix of reform, repression, negotiation, and innovation, the leadership managed to restore a measure of stability and prepare for the challenges to come. As the Ashanti Empire emerged from internal civil conflicts and solidified its administrative and military reforms, a new and far more dangerous confrontation began to loom on the horizon. one that would bring the empire into direct and open conflict with the British Crown. While tensions between the Ashanti and British had simmered for decades, especially over trade routes and regional alliances, the early decades of the 19th century saw these frictions escalate into a full-scale war. The First Anglo-Ashanti War marked a turning point in West African history, pitting one of the most powerful African empires against the growing influence of British imperial ambition. By the early 1820s, British interests on the Gold Coast had become increasingly formalized. Following the decline of the slave trade and the passage of the Slave Trade Act in Britain in the early part of the century, British policy in West Africa began to shift toward commercial expansion, anti-slavery patrols, and gradual territorial consolidation. Forts like Cape Coast Castle, long the center of British trade, now became administrative hubs, as London began to assert more direct political control over its coastal holdings. In contrast, the Ashanti Empire still operated under a system of indirect rule and traditional governance. It maintained its own networks of diplomacy, tribute collection, and internal administration. The Ashanti viewed themselves as equals to any European power, including the British, and expected foreign officials to engage with them through the protocols of respect, gift exchange, and political negotiation. However, the British increasingly saw the Ashanti as an obstacle to their economic and political objectives. At the heart of the conflict was the issue of control over the southern trade routes and the status of the Fante Confederacy. As explored in previous sections, the Ashanti had made significant advances into southern territories and sought to bring the Fante under their political influence. While they had achieved partial military success, full control of the coast remained out of reach. The British, aligned with the Fante and increasingly invested in protecting their own economic interests, viewed further Ashanti incursions as a direct threat. The immediate spark for war came in the early part of the 1820s, when tensions over tribute collection and regional authority escalated into skirmishes between Ashanti forces and British-allied Fante towns. The British governor of Cape Coast, Charles McCarthy, attempted to assert British influence inland and called for a punitive expedition against the Ashanti. Underestimating the scale and organization of the Ashanti military, he marched inland with a mixed force of British troops, West Indian soldiers, and local auxiliaries. In the year 1824, this force encountered the main Ashanti army near the Pra River at a site later known as the Battle of Nsamankau. What followed was one of the most decisive and shocking defeats suffered by a British-led force in early West African colonial history. The Ashanti army, well organized and deeply motivated, overwhelmed the British troops. Governor McCarthy was killed in battle, and his skull was later sent to Kumasi as a trophy, a grim symbol of Ashanti victory and British miscalculation. The Ashanti triumph at Nsamankau sent shockwaves through the British establishment. Not only had they suffered a humiliating defeat, but they also realized that the Ashanti could not be dismissed as a minor inland kingdom. In response, the British reinforced their coastal defenses, withdrew further inland operations, and reassessed their long-term strategy for the region. For the Ashanti, the victory was a reaffirmation of their military prowess and political legitimacy. However, it also set the stage for a prolonged period of tension and low-intensity conflict. While no major battles occurred immediately after Nsamankau, both sides engaged in smaller engagements, diplomatic maneuvers, and efforts to consolidate their respective alliances. Ashanti embassies were sent to the coast to negotiate terms, but mutual suspicion and conflicting objectives made diplomacy difficult. The British demanded that the Ashanti withdraw from all territories south of the Pra River and cease interference in Fante affairs. The Ashanti, in turn, insisted on recognition of their sphere of influence and sought restitution for British attacks on their allies and trade convoys. During the years following the battle, the British fortified their coastal positions and sought to strengthen their alliances with southern states. They established formal treaties with coastal towns, creating a patchwork of protectorates that further complicated relations with the Ashanti. The British also began to modernize their military presence, bringing in more disciplined forces and building infrastructure to support future campaigns. By contrast, the Ashanti Empire faced internal pressures. While victorious in battle, the war had strained resources and disrupted trade. The death of Osei Bonsu had left a leadership gap, and his successors struggled to maintain unity among the various factions within the royal court and provincial leadership. Nonetheless, the empire remained strong and deeply committed to preserving its autonomy and regional authority. The war formally continued until the year 1831, though active hostilities diminished after the initial confrontations. That year, a peace treaty was signed between the British and the Ashanti. Under the terms of the treaty, both sides agreed to cease hostilities and recognize the Prempe River as the boundary between their respective spheres of influence. The Ashanti agreed to withdraw from several southern towns, while the British pledged to respect Ashanti sovereignty inland. Though the treaty brought temporary peace, it did not resolve the deeper tensions between the two powers. The Ashanti viewed the treaty as a pragmatic pause, while the British saw it as a step toward greater coastal control. Both sides continued to prepare for future confrontations, even as they resumed limited trade and diplomatic contact. Following the exhaustion and disruption caused by the First Anglo-Ashanti War, the Ashanti Empire entered a period of relative calm and introspection. While the memory of conflict with the British lingered, both sides turned inward to consolidate their respective domains. For the Ashanti, the accession of Kwaku Dua I to the Golden Stool in the mid-19th century ushered in a new chapter, one defined not by military campaigns or territorial ambitions, but by peace-building, cultural preservation, and religious tolerance. His reign, spanning more than 3 decades, would prove to be one of the most stable in Ashanti history. Kwaku Dua I rose to power in the year 1834, following a period of succession uncertainty. He was not a military leader by background, nor did he come to power through conquest or force. Instead, he was chosen through consensus among the kingmakers of Kumasi, with the support of the Queen Mother and the leading elders of the Oyoko dynasty. His selection represented a deliberate move toward unity and moderation at a time when the empire sorely needed healing. From the outset, Kwaku Dua I made it clear that his reign would prioritize peace and internal reform. The costly wars with the British and the long-standing tensions with the Fante states had revealed the limits of perpetual military engagement. Moreover, internal divisions within the empire, fueled by court rivalries, regional grievances, and the growing complexity of governance, demanded a more diplomatic and stabilizing leadership. One of Kwaku Dua's first actions as Asantehene was to reaffirm the peace treaty with the British signed at the end of the First Anglo-Ashanti War. While the Ashanti had not been forced to surrender, the terms of the treaty restricted their influence in the southern coastal zones. Kwaku Dua, rather than contesting these terms militarily, chose to strengthen diplomatic relations. Envoys were exchanged, trade resumed under regulated conditions, and both parties worked to avoid provocations. This period of cautious engagement allowed the Ashanti to regain their economic footing without the threat of immediate conflict. Internally, Kwaku Dua initiated reforms aimed at restoring trust between the central government in Kumasi and the outlying regions of the empire. One of his key policies was the reaffirmation of the rights of provincial chiefs, particularly those in regions that had previously shown resistance to over-centralization. By recognizing local autonomy in domestic affairs, while maintaining the primacy of the Golden Stool and imperial allegiance, he reduced tensions and ensured the continued loyalty of influential leaders. Kwaku Dua also took steps to strengthen the administrative structures of the empire. He expanded the role of the National Council, the Asante-Manhiamu, encouraging wider participation from representatives across the kingdom. This body not only functioned as a legislative forum, but also served as a conflict resolution mechanism, helping to mediate disputes among chiefs, families, and trade guilds. Through this inclusive model of governance, Kwaku Dua revived the tradition of consensus-based rule that had characterized the early Ashanti Union. Another significant aspect of his reign was the promotion of religious tolerance. While the Ashanti state was traditionally rooted in ancestral worship, spirit veneration, and the rituals associated with the Golden Stool, the growing presence of Muslim merchants and scholars from the northern regions brought new religious practices into the empire. Rather than suppressing these foreign beliefs, Kwaku Dua allowed Muslim communities to establish mosques and practice freely in areas such as Kumasi and Salaga. This policy of tolerance extended not only to Islam, but also to other cultural expressions and ethnic groups within the empire. As a result, the Ashanti capital became increasingly cosmopolitan, attracting traders, artisans, and scholars from across West Africa. The social fabric of Kumasi reflected this diversity, with neighborhoods organized along lines of profession, ethnicity, and religious affiliation. Markets flourished, and economic activity rebounded as trust was restored and conflict subsided. Kwaku Dua's reign also saw significant investment in cultural life. The production of kente cloth, gold jewelry, ceremonial stools, and other markers of Ashanti identity reached new heights. The arts were not merely decorative, they were deeply embedded in political and spiritual life. State-sponsored festivals, such as the Adai, continued to serve as occasions for reaffirming loyalty to the monarchy, displaying wealth, and performing traditional music and dance. These events reinforced the unity of the empire and the legitimacy of its institutions. Education and literacy also gained increased attention. Although formal schools in the European sense were not widespread, Islamic scholars introduced Quranic schools in some northern districts, and Ashanti scribes began to use Arabic and modified scripts for administrative and commercial record-keeping. Oral traditions, however, remained dominant. The Akiem, or royal linguists, continued to serve as custodians of law, history, and court procedures. Their mastery of language, proverbs, and precedent made them essential advisors in both governance and diplomacy. One of Kwaku Dua's more ambitious policies was the regulation of trade. While the empire no longer controlled the coast, it still dominated key inland trade routes that linked the savanna to the forest and, eventually, to the coastal forts. Kwaku Dua worked to reduce corruption among toll collectors, improve road maintenance, and protect caravan routes from banditry. By ensuring the safety of traders and the reliability of taxation, he restored confidence in Ashanti markets and bolstered the empire's revenue. Despite these achievements, Kwaku Dua's reign was not without challenges. The growing presence of Christian missionaries in coastal regions, often under British protection, introduced new tensions. While the Ashanti tolerated diverse religious expressions within their own domains, they viewed missionary activity, especially when accompanied by political or cultural criticism, as a form of foreign interference. Nevertheless, Kwaku Dua managed to contain these tensions through measured diplomacy, ensuring that religious disputes did not escalate into broader political crises. Succession also posed difficulties toward the end of his reign. As Kwaku Dua aged, the question of who would follow him grew more urgent. Factions emerged at court, each promoting their preferred candidates. The absence of a clear succession plan threatened to destabilize the fragile balance he had maintained. Though he attempted to manage this process, his death in the year 1867 left unresolved tensions that would eventually lead to another period of unrest. The era of peace and cultural consolidation that marked the reign of Kwaku Dua I left the Ashanti Empire more stable and unified than it had been in decades. Yet peace, as history often shows, is rarely permanent. By the mid-19th century, changes in British colonial policy, growing economic ambitions, and increasing friction over border control began to unravel the fragile balance between the Ashanti and their southern neighbors. These rising tensions would eventually erupt into a brief but telling conflict, the Second Anglo-Ashanti War. Unlike the more dramatic and prolonged confrontation of the First War, the Second Anglo-Ashanti conflict was limited in duration and scope. However, its causes and consequences were deeply significant, highlighting the fundamental challenges facing the Ashanti as they navigated a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. By the early 1860s, the British had expanded their influence beyond the coastal forts. Their presence in towns like Cape Coast, Elmina, and Accra was no longer confined to trade alone. It now included formal administrative structures, missionary outposts, and a growing sense of imperial entitlement. London's policy had shifted toward establishing protectorates, integrating local territories into the British colonial system, and consolidating control over trade and governance across the Gold Coast. For the Ashanti, this evolution in British behavior was alarming. The empire had long regarded itself as a sovereign state, equal in dignity, if not technology, to any European power. Its political structure was independent, its economy internally managed, and its military feared throughout the region. However, British expansionism threatened to reduce the Ashanti to just another subject people in a colonial framework that showed little respect for African sovereignty. A key point of contention in the years leading up to the war was the status of the Asin territory. This buffer region, lying between Ashanti lands and British-controlled coastal areas, had long been contested. Although nominally independent, the Asin had often leaned toward British influence, seeking protection from Ashanti dominance. For the Ashanti, this alliance was both a diplomatic insult and a strategic threat. Control over Asin meant control over trade routes, access to southern markets, and the ability to monitor British movements. In the year 1863, tensions reached a breaking point. An incident involving a British surveyor and Asin leadership became the spark. The Ashanti accused the Asin chief of violating their sovereignty and demanded compensation. When the British refused to support Ashanti demands and instead reinforced their support for the Asin, relations deteriorated rapidly. Kwaku Dua I, though aging and increasingly frail, authorized a limited military expedition to assert Ashanti claims over the disputed region. Ashanti forces advanced into Asin territory with the intention of re-establishing political control and restoring what they saw as rightful influence. The British, interpreting this movement as a direct act of aggression, declared war and mobilized their forces in Cape Coast and other nearby forts. The military engagements that followed were limited and inconclusive. British forces, composed of colonial troops and local auxiliaries, were unprepared for a sustained inland campaign. The Ashanti, while capable fighters, were reluctant to commit to a full-scale war given the fragile health of their king and the political instability that loomed over succession. Skirmishes were exchanged, border patrols clashed, and diplomatic envoys made urgent appeals for de-escalation. By the middle of 1864, both sides recognized the costs of continuing the conflict. The British had not achieved a decisive victory, and the Ashanti leadership feared that prolonged war might further weaken the aging Kwaku Dua's authority and destabilize the empire. A stalemate was acknowledged, and hostilities subsided without the signing of a formal peace treaty. The Second Anglo-Ashanti War may have been brief, but it revealed several key dynamics that would shape future events. First, it confirmed that the era of informal coexistence between the Ashanti and the British was drawing to a close. The British no longer viewed the Ashanti as partners in trade, but increasingly as obstacles to control. Their growing presence in the interior and efforts to integrate local states into their protectorate system posed an existential threat to Ashanti independence. Second, the war exposed the vulnerability of the Ashanti state in the face of modern imperialism. While the empire remained strong militarily, it lacked the artillery, medical infrastructure, and logistical systems that European powers now deployed in their colonial campaigns. Furthermore, the Ashanti diplomatic model, built on oral negotiation, tribute exchange, and ritual diplomacy, struggled to match the bureaucratic and strategic rigidity of British colonial administration. Third, the succession crisis that followed Kwaku Dua's death in the year 1867 was worsened by the lingering uncertainty of the war's outcome. Without a clear military victory and with no treaty to restore diplomatic clarity, factions within the Ashanti court debated the appropriate response to British actions. Some advocated for renewed war, others for cautious diplomacy, and a few began to question whether peaceful coexistence with an expanding colonial state was even possible. In the years that followed, the Ashanti Empire would experience significant internal upheaval, with rival claimants to the throne, regional defiance, and growing anxiety over British intentions. Although the Second Anglo-Ashanti War had ended without a definitive conclusion, it had set the stage for a deeper, more dangerous confrontation, one that would unfold in the decades ahead and eventually lead to open colonial conquest. The death of Asantehene Kwaku Dua I in the year 1867 marked the end of an era of relative peace, tolerance, and internal cohesion in the Ashanti Empire. While his long reign had helped stabilize the kingdom after decades of warfare and external tension, it had also masked unresolved political rivalries and succession uncertainties. With his passing, these tensions erupted into a prolonged and destabilizing internal conflict known as the Ashanti Civil War. The roots of the conflict lay in the complexities of Ashanti succession. Unlike monarchies based on strict primogeniture, the Ashanti political system followed matrilineal inheritance, whereby royal authority passed through the mother's line. In theory, this system was designed to prevent dynastic monopolies and allow for broad consensus in the selection of rulers. In practice, however, it could lead to intense rivalries among royal candidates, especially in moments of political fragmentation. After the death of Kwaku Dua I, there was no immediate consensus on his successor. Several factions within the royal court, each backed by powerful queen mothers, chiefs, and military leaders, promoted different candidates. Some supported the claim of Kofi Kakari, a respected noble with ties to the Oyoko clan. Others favored Kwabena Duomo or Mensa Bonsu, both of whom also had legitimate claims to the Golden Stool. The absence of a clear frontrunner turned the succession debate into a national crisis. The early stages of the civil conflict were marked by political intrigue, diplomatic maneuvering, and factional violence within Kumasi. Supporters of rival claimants attempted to seize control of the palace, mobilize regional allies, and gain the blessing of the Asantemanhiyamu, the council of elders and chiefs responsible for confirming the new Asantehene. When compromise failed, open hostilities began, and what had started as a dispute over succession escalated into a full-scale civil war. Throughout the late 1860s and into the 1870s, different parts of the empire aligned themselves with different pretenders to the throne. Kumasi itself became a battlefield of shifting loyalties, with its streets and royal precincts witnessing violent clashes. The wider empire fractured into zones of control, each governed by its own leaders claiming legitimacy in the name of a different Asantehene. One of the most significant phases of the conflict unfolded when Kofi Kakari was installed as Asantehene in the early 1870s. Though he briefly achieved recognition from the Central Council, his reign was plagued by opposition from rival factions who refused to acknowledge his authority. His leadership was further undermined by military defeats and allegations of mismanagement, leading to his eventual destoolement, a formal and public removal from power. In his place, Mensa Bonsu emerged as the next claimant, ascending to the Golden Stool during a time of great instability. Mensa Bonsu was a capable leader and sought to restore order by reasserting royal authority, rebuilding the capital, and reorganizing the administration. He launched a campaign to re-establish control over rebellious provinces and reintegrate dissident chiefs. However, the damage done by years of civil war had already weakened the fabric of the empire. Mensa Bonsu's reign, though initially promising, became increasingly autocratic. He attempted to centralize power more aggressively than his predecessors, diminishing the traditional role of the council and sidelining local chiefs. His harsh policies and disregard for long-standing customs alienated many of his former supporters. In a society that had long relied on consensus and ritual legitimacy, Mensa Bonsu's heavy-handedness sparked renewed opposition. By the mid-1880s, the dissatisfaction with his rule reached a tipping point. A coalition of chiefs, elders, and military commanders united against him, leading to another wave of civil strife. Mensa Bonsu was eventually destooled and exiled, bringing yet another chapter of instability to the Ashanti throne. These years of civil war had devastating effects on the empire. Economically, trade routes were disrupted, gold production declined, and market confidence plummeted. The once prosperous capital of Kumasi fell into disrepair, its infrastructure neglected, and its population reduced by violence and migration. Socially, families and clans were torn apart by conflicting loyalties, and the ritual unity represented by the Golden Stool began to lose its symbolic power. Most critically, the empire's military capacity deteriorated. The Ashanti army, once the pride of the empire, suffered from internal divisions, poor coordination, and declining morale. Arms supplies diminished, and experienced commanders were either killed, exiled, or stripped of their authority. The empire was no longer able to project power effectively into its provinces, let alone defend its frontiers from external threats. These vulnerabilities did not go unnoticed by the British. Observing the internal fragmentation of the Ashanti state, colonial officials began to prepare for further intervention. The British had already established greater control over the coastal territories, and the disarray within the Ashanti kingdom presented a strategic opportunity to expand inland without facing the formidable resistance of earlier decades. The Ashanti Civil War also had a cultural and psychological toll. The legitimacy of the Asantehene, once considered sacred and inviolable, was now regularly challenged and publicly debated. The ritual authority of the Golden Stool, long the symbol of Ashanti unity, was weakened by repeated disputes over succession and political manipulation. For many within the empire, this period marked a spiritual as well as political crisis. Yet, amid the chaos, some institutions endured. The Queen Mothers retained significant influence, often acting as mediators and protectors of tradition. The Council of Elders continued to convene, even in times of upheaval, striving to preserve some semblance of continuity. And the people of the Ashanti heartland, though battered by war and political betrayal, maintained a strong attachment to their identity, history, and institutions. By the early 1870s, the Ashanti Empire, though weakened by years of internal civil conflict, still held symbolic and strategic power in the interior of the Gold Coast. Its capital, Kumasi, remained a center of culture, tradition, and regional authority. However, the cracks were showing. The civil wars had diminished the cohesion of the state, weakened its army, and eroded confidence in central leadership. Meanwhile, the British Empire was growing increasingly assertive in its ambitions across West Africa. The British presence on the Gold Coast had evolved considerably from the days of coastal trade forts and negotiated treaties. By the time of the Third Anglo-Ashanti conflict, Britain had begun consolidating its colonial holdings in the region. Through a series of treaties, protectorate declarations, and military expeditions, British authority was extending beyond the coastal towns and creeping inland. The imperial aim was clear: to remove indigenous obstacles to full colonial control and secure direct access to the resources and markets of the hinterland. One of the final flashpoints came in the early 1870s when the Ashanti attempted to reassert control over the southern town of Elmina. Elmina, historically a key coastal settlement, had long been under Dutch influence. The Dutch, facing increasing pressure in West Africa and reconsidering their colonial commitments, agreed to transfer ownership of Elmina to the British. This transfer, signed without Ashanti consultation, deeply angered the Ashanti court. The Ashanti had long viewed Elmina as part of their sphere of influence. They had maintained relations with the Dutch and expected to be treated as sovereign equals in matters concerning the region. When the Dutch sold their interest to the British, the Ashanti leadership interpreted this not only as a diplomatic insult, but as a violation of past agreements and a threat to their regional authority. In response, the Ashanti began mobilizing their forces. Under the leadership of Asantehene Kofi Karakari, the empire sought to challenge British encroachment. Ashanti troops moved into the disputed regions and engaged in armed skirmishes near the coastal borders. They also attempted to rally support from southern allies and to threaten trade routes that supplied British garrisons. The British reaction was swift and uncompromising. Viewing the Ashanti actions as hostile and unacceptable, the colonial administration in Cape Coast requested reinforcements from London. In the year 1873, the British dispatched a professional expeditionary force under the command of Sir Garnet Wolseley. This force, unlike previous colonial militias, was equipped with modern weapons, trained in formal military doctrine, and prepared for sustained inland operations. The British expedition included troops from various parts of the empire, including European soldiers, West Indian regiments, and local African auxiliaries. They were supported by engineers, medical staff, supply caravans, and communications teams, an indication of Britain's growing investment in its colonial enterprise. The campaign into Ashanti territory was carefully planned. The British forces advanced slowly but methodically, establishing fortified camps and securing supply lines as they moved northward through dense forests and difficult terrain. Their goal was not simply to repel Ashanti aggression, but to strike at the heart of the empire, Kumasi itself. The Ashanti, though still capable of organizing significant resistance, were at a disadvantage. The empire's military had suffered from the disruptions of the civil wars. Firearm supplies had dwindled, coordination between provinces was inconsistent, and morale was unstable. Nonetheless, Ashanti warriors staged a series of ambushes and attempted to block British progress through narrow forest paths. The terrain favored them, but British firepower and discipline prevailed in most encounters. One of the most notable battles of the campaign occurred at Amoafo. In this engagement, the Ashanti mounted a fierce defense, using knowledge of the terrain to harass and delay British troops. Despite their bravery and tactical ingenuity, they were ultimately overcome by the superior firepower and logistical coordination of the British forces. The loss at Amoafo opened the path to Kumasi and dealt a significant blow to Ashanti morale. By early 1874, the British reached Kumasi. What followed was a dramatic and symbolic moment in the long history of Ashanti-British relations. British troops entered the city largely unopposed, as the Ashanti leadership had ordered a tactical withdrawal to avoid further bloodshed and destruction. Kumasi, once a proud and powerful capital, was occupied by a foreign army. Rather than attempt permanent occupation, the British chose to destroy large parts of the city. Palaces, temples, and public buildings were burned. The symbolic heart of the Ashanti Empire was desecrated, sending a clear message about British intentions. The aim was not just military victory, but psychological domination, to humiliate the Ashanti leadership and deter any future resistance. After their campaign, the British imposed a treaty that reflected their strategic objectives. The Ashanti were forced to renounce all claims to territories south of the Pra River. They had to accept British control over Elmina and recognize British political supremacy in the region. An indemnity was demanded, and hostages were taken to ensure compliance. Though the Ashanti were not formally annexed, their independence was significantly curtailed. The Third Anglo-Ashanti War was a watershed moment. It demonstrated the shift from negotiated coexistence to imperial imposition. The Ashanti, once able to confront European powers on relatively equal terms, were now faced with a modern, industrialized adversary committed to colonial domination. The destruction of Kumasi marked more than the loss of a battle. It marked the symbolic end of Ashanti invulnerability. Yet, despite the devastation, the Ashanti Empire survived. It remained formally independent, retained internal governance, and began rebuilding its institutions. The resilience of the Ashanti people, their commitment to cultural preservation, and their adherence to traditional authority structures allowed them to regroup and resist full incorporation, at least for a time. As the 19th century neared its end, the Ashanti Empire stood on increasingly unstable ground. While it had survived the destruction of Kumasi and the humiliating defeat of the Third Anglo-Ashanti War, the once powerful kingdom was now a shadow of its former self. Political influence was confined, trade was disrupted, and the presence of the British in the region had grown stronger and more organized. The British had learned from earlier conflicts and were now determined to bring all of the Gold Coast, including the Ashanti hinterland, under firm colonial rule. The British Crown had formally declared the coastal regions of the Gold Coast as a colony in the mid-19th century, and over the following decades, British administrators expanded their influence inland through diplomacy, trade, and military intervention. They signed treaties with local chiefs, extended protectorate arrangements, and gradually eroded the autonomy of numerous African states in the region. The Ashanti remained one of the few holdouts, a kingdom still governed by its own customs and refusing to accept British control. It was against this backdrop that Asantehene Prempe I ascended to the Golden Stool. Prempe I, a young and determined ruler, inherited a weakened but unbroken empire. His reign began during a period of fragile recovery. Kumasi had been rebuilt, internal administration had stabilized, and there were genuine efforts to reassert Ashanti cultural identity and political coherence. However, the empire's military power had declined, and its diplomatic position was precarious. Prempe I took a strategic and cautious approach. He sought to maintain Ashanti independence not through war, but through diplomacy. Understanding the overwhelming military superiority of the British, he attempted to build relationships with European powers, appeal to British officials for fair treatment, and demonstrate that the Ashanti posed no threat to colonial stability. Letters were sent, envoys dispatched, and efforts made to negotiate a peaceful coexistence. Despite these efforts, British colonial authorities viewed Prempe I's refusal to accept a British protectorate as unacceptable. Their policy had shifted decisively toward full control. In London, imperial ambitions were driven by a belief in the civilizing mission, commercial opportunity, and geopolitical competition with other European powers, particularly France and Germany. West Africa, and especially the interior of the Gold Coast, was seen as vital to securing British economic and strategic interests. By the early 1890s, pressure was mounting. British colonial officials accused Prempe I of obstructing trade, defying British authority, and refusing to submit to lawful rule. These accusations, while largely exaggerated or unfounded, provided a pretext for direct military intervention. British newspapers and politicians framed the Ashanti Kingdom as defiant and backwards, an obstacle to progress in a region increasingly described as part of Britain's rightful imperial domain. In the year 1895, the British government authorized a full-scale expedition into Ashanti territory. The mission was officially described as a peaceful one, aimed at securing compliance and persuading the Ashanti to accept a British protectorate. In reality, it was a well-planned military operation designed to subdue the kingdom and eliminate its political independence once and for all. The expedition was led by Sir Francis Scott and included several thousand troops, many of them from West African regiments under British command. Unlike earlier campaigns, this force met no organized military resistance. Prempe I, fully aware of the destructive capacity of the British military and determined to avoid the fate of his predecessors, ordered that there be no armed conflict. The Ashanti would not fight a war they could not win. Instead, Prempe I chose submission without humiliation. He sent messages to the British stating his willingness to negotiate and his desire for peace. When the British force arrived in Kumasi in early 1896, they found the city calm and orderly. The Asantehene greeted the British officers with dignity, hoping that his decision to avoid war would earn his kingdom a fair settlement. But the British had other intentions. Despite the absence of resistance, the British declared that the Ashanti Kingdom had refused to comply with colonial policy and must therefore be annexed. Prempe I, along with several senior officials, was arrested and publicly deposed. The Asantehene did not resist arrest. In an iconic moment, he refused to kneel before the British governor, asserting his dignity as the sovereign ruler of his people even in defeat. Prempe I and his entourage were exiled to the Seychelles, an island colony in the Indian Ocean. The exile was not only a punishment but a strategic move to remove all symbols of Ashanti sovereignty from the region. The British then formally annexed the Ashanti Kingdom into the Gold Coast colony, declaring the end of Ashanti independence. Kumasi was occupied, and British residents were installed to oversee administration and enforce colonial law. The fall of the Ashanti Kingdom in 1896 marked the collapse of the last major West African empire to resist European colonization. It ended over 2 centuries of political autonomy, cultural development, and military strength. The symbolic and spiritual power of the Golden Stool endured, but the Ashanti were now subject to foreign rule. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Ashanti people, though politically subdued, remained culturally unbroken. The British had occupied Kumasi, exiled Asante Prempe I, and annexed the kingdom into the expanding Gold Coast colony. But beneath the surface of British rule, the spiritual heart of the Ashanti nation still pulsed with quiet resistance. That spirit, embedded in tradition, identity, and sacred authority, would soon rise in defense of the most revered symbol of Ashanti sovereignty, the Golden Stool. To the British, the Ashanti had been defeated. Administrators in Accra and London believed that with the king removed and colonial rule installed, the Ashanti population would gradually accept their new place within the British Empire. But this misjudgment ignored the central role that the Golden Stool, Sika Dwa Kofi, played in Ashanti life. Unlike a throne of state or a ceremonial object, the Golden Stool was believed to house the soul of the Ashanti people. It was not to be sat upon, touched, or even seen by those uninitiated into its spiritual significance. It represented the collective essence of the nation, past, present, and future. When the British exiled Prempe I, they had not captured the Golden Stool. It remained hidden, guarded by those sworn to protect it at any cost. For the Ashanti, the stool's safety was more important than the fate of any ruler. As long as the stool remained untouched, the soul of the nation endured. In the year 1900, this delicate balance was shattered by an act of colonial arrogance. Sir Frederick Hodgson, the British governor of the Gold Coast, traveled to Kumasi to deliver a public address. During this speech, he demanded that the Ashanti people produce the Golden Stool, so that he, as representative of the British Crown, might sit upon it. He viewed the stool as a symbol of royal authority, something akin to a European throne, and assumed that possession of it would complete British sovereignty over the region. The reaction among the Ashanti was immediate and profound. To them, the governor's demand was not simply offensive, it was sacrilegious. It signaled not only ignorance of their traditions, but a direct attack on the very essence of their nationhood. The insult could not go unanswered. Although the Ashanti had no Asante at the time, leadership emerged from an unexpected source: a woman. Ya Asantewa, the queen mother of Ejisu, rose to prominence with remarkable courage and vision. As a senior member of the royal family and a respected elder, she wielded considerable influence. But more than that, she embodied the fierce spirit of resistance that had long defined Ashanti identity. In a now famous council meeting where some chiefs hesitated to take up arms, Ya Asantewa reportedly declared that if the men would not fight, then the women would. Her leadership galvanized the people. With her guidance, the Ashanti launched a rebellion to protect the stool, their honor, and their spiritual survival. The war that followed, often called the War of the Golden Stool or the Ya Asantewa War, was not a large-scale conventional conflict. It was a determined uprising waged by an empire without a king, led by a woman against a heavily armed colonial power. The Ashanti mobilized warriors from across the central regions and laid siege to the British fort in Kumasi, where Governor Hodgson and his staff had taken refuge. For several weeks, the Ashanti forces surrounded the fort, cutting off supplies and communication. The British, though fortified, found themselves increasingly isolated and under pressure. Hodgson, caught off guard by the intensity of the uprising, managed to escape with a small column of troops through the forest. The retreat was perilous, and many soldiers perished along the way due to disease, hunger, and Ashanti attacks. In response, British authorities dispatched reinforcements from the coast and neighboring colonies. Modern artillery, machine guns, and a larger military force gave the British an advantage. Over the following months, they gradually pushed back Ashanti fighters, reclaimed key positions, and arrested resistance leaders. Kumasi was reoccupied, and a systematic campaign was launched to dismantle the rebellion. Asante War was eventually captured along with several members of the Ashanti aristocracy. Like Prempe I before her, she was exiled, this time to the Seychelles, where she remained until her death. Her resistance had not succeeded in restoring Ashanti independence, but it had rekindled the spirit of defiance and unity among her people. Importantly, the British never found the Golden Stool. It had been safely hidden away in a secret location, known only to its guardians. Though the war had been lost militarily, the sacred soul of the Ashanti survived, untouched and undefeated. The protection of the stool became the enduring triumph of the Ashanti in a time of conquest. In the aftermath of the conflict, British rule over Ashanti territory became more formalized. The region was declared a British protectorate, and colonial administrators tightened their grip on governance, taxation, and legal systems. However, they also learned to tread more carefully. The War of the Golden Stool had revealed the depth of Ashanti resistance, and many British officials developed a new, if grudging, respect for Ashanti customs and political structures. Indirect rule became the favored strategy. British colonial policy began to integrate traditional authority figures into the administration, recognizing that attempting to erase Ashanti identity would only lead to further unrest. Chiefs were appointed or approved by the colonial government but allowed to govern their localities according to Ashanti customs, so long as they remained loyal to the British Crown. The War of the Golden Stool marked the final armed resistance of the Ashanti Empire. Though politically subordinated, the people retained a strong sense of cultural continuity. The stool was never handed over, and the British never fully controlled the Ashanti spiritual domain. What began as an insult to sacred tradition had become a defining act of national pride. After the fierce and symbolic War of the Golden Stool in the year 1900, the Ashanti Empire, though unbroken in cultural spirit, was decisively subdued in political terms. The British had failed to capture the Golden Stool, but they succeeded in asserting full administrative control over the Ashanti region. By the year 1902, the British formally declared the Ashanti territories as part of the British Gold Coast colony. This act marked the official end of the Ashanti Empire as an independent state and ushered in a new era of colonial rule. The annexation of Ashanti lands was not simply a military outcome. It represented a significant shift in British imperial policy. The Ashanti were no longer treated as a foreign nation to be negotiated with or confronted in war. Instead, they were considered colonial subjects, and their territory was absorbed into the bureaucratic machinery of the empire. This transformation was codified in new laws, enforced by British officials, and supported by military garrisons stationed across strategic locations in the region. British colonial governance in the Ashanti region took on a particular character shaped by both practical necessity and imperial ideology. After the costly wars and multiple failed attempts to govern the Ashanti by direct force, British administrators turned to the model of indirect rule. This approach sought to govern the colony through local institutions and traditional leaders, now operating under colonial supervision. Traditional Ashanti chiefs, once autonomous rulers under the symbolic supremacy of the Asante Hene, were now answerable to district commissioners and colonial governors. Their authority remained substantial in local matters, such as land disputes, marriage laws, and village governance, but was now contingent on loyalty to the colonial state. Chiefs who resisted British oversight were removed and replaced by more compliant figures, undermining some of the legitimacy that had previously grounded chieftaincy in sacred tradition. The office of Asante Hene itself was abolished following the exile of Prempe I. For years, there was no king to occupy the Golden Stool, and its presence was guarded by a select group of elders and traditional priests. The absence of a central figurehead in Ashanti society created a political vacuum, but also allowed the colonial government to operate without the direct challenge of a unified indigenous leader. The British were keenly aware of the power the Asante Hene once held, and they took calculated steps to prevent any resurgence of centralized authority. Despite the political subjugation, the Ashanti cultural identity remained remarkably resilient. Language, customs, festivals, and the reverence for the Golden Stool continued to thrive. The Adai festival, which honored ancestors and reaffirmed loyalty to the stool, was still celebrated, albeit more discreetly. Ashanti oral history, passed down through generations of Akiame linguists, preserved the memory of past glory and resistance. Economically, the British colonial administration introduced significant changes. The Ashanti region, rich in gold and fertile land, became a vital contributor to the colonial economy. British companies expanded gold mining operations, especially in areas around Obuasi, turning them into some of the most productive gold fields in the empire. Roads and railways were constructed not for the benefit of the local population, but to extract and export resources more efficiently. While these developments generated revenue and created jobs, they also altered traditional economic systems. Land previously managed by clans and lineages was surveyed and categorized under British property laws. This undermined communal ownership and sometimes resulted in the displacement of families who had farmed the same land for generations. Taxes were imposed on local populations, often payable in British currency, forcing many Ashanti people into the colonial cash economy. Education also expanded under colonial rule, though primarily through Christian missionary institutions. Schools were established in various towns, teaching literacy, arithmetic, and Christian doctrine. While some Ashanti elites embraced this education as a path to advancement within the colonial system, others viewed it as a vehicle for cultural erosion. English increasingly became the language of administration and higher learning, while Ashanti traditions were often marginalized or discouraged within formal institutions. The British administration also introduced legal reforms, creating new courts and legal codes based on British law. While traditional tribunals were still allowed to function in some areas, particularly for family and civil disputes, criminal law was brought firmly under colonial control. The dual legal system led to confusion and, at times, conflict between colonial judges and traditional authorities. Throughout this period, resistance never fully disappeared. Though large-scale rebellion was no longer possible, quiet forms of defiance persisted. Songs, proverbs, and stories reminded people of their history and instilled pride in Ashanti heritage. Communities continued to observe rites and rituals that affirmed their connection to the Golden Stool and the ancestors. Even under colonial surveillance, Ashanti identity endured as a quiet but powerful act of resistance. More than 2 decades had passed since Asantehene Prempe I had been exiled to the Seychelles by British authorities following the annexation of the Ashanti Kingdom and the events surrounding the War of the Golden Stool. In those years, the Ashanti people had lived under British colonial administration, their political sovereignty stripped, but their cultural foundations largely intact. Throughout this period, the Golden Stool remained hidden and sacred, and the memory of Prempe I endured as a symbol of pride, resistance, and dignity. The Ashanti had not forgotten their king. Even in his absence, Prempe I remained a unifying symbol. Messages, stories, and songs continued to circulate in his name. He was remembered not as a defeated ruler, but as a leader who had sacrificed personal power to preserve the soul of his people and protect their sacred institutions. In exile, Prempe I maintained his dignity. Although removed from his homeland, he never renounced his identity or his duty to his people. By the early decades of the 20th century, British colonial administrators were facing growing challenges in managing the Ashanti territories. The absence of a central indigenous authority had led to confusion, rivalries, and growing dissatisfaction among the population. Chiefs had been co-opted into the colonial system, but they lacked the widespread legitimacy that the Asantehene once commanded. Disputes over succession, land, and local governance grew more difficult to mediate. Meanwhile, the indirect rule system, which depended on functioning traditional leadership, was faltering in practice without a unifying symbolic figure. In this context, a reconsideration of Ashanti leadership emerged within colonial policy circles. Some British officials began to argue that restoring the Asantehene title, though carefully stripped of its sovereign power, would improve administrative efficiency and help pacify a region still marked by proud cultural autonomy. It was not a return to independence, but rather a strategic compromise, allowing the Ashanti to re-establish a ceremonial monarchy that served colonial interests while satisfying traditional expectations. The idea gained traction, and eventually plans were made to permit Prempe I to return to the Gold Coast. After more than 2 decades in exile, he was allowed to come home, not as a sovereign king, but as a traditional ruler within the confines of colonial authority. Yet to the Ashanti people, this distinction mattered little. The return of their king, regardless of British limitations, was a cause for celebration and a reaffirmation of identity. In the year 1924, Prempe I arrived back in Kumasi to scenes of deep emotion and national pride. Thousands gathered to welcome him, draped in cloth, singing songs of welcome, and performing dances of ancestral remembrance. Elders wept, warriors stood in formation, and priests offered prayers and libations. The capital that had once been burned and occupied now came alive in the glow of symbolic restoration. Prempe I was not restored to his former powers. Under colonial arrangements, his role was redefined as a chief, a position that conferred ceremonial importance and administrative responsibilities, but was subordinate to the colonial governor and his representatives. However, within Ashanti society, Prempe remained the Asantehene, the guardian of the Golden Stool, the chosen of the ancestors, and the living link between the past and the present. The ceremonial aspects of his restoration were rich in meaning. Traditional rites were performed to mark his return. The sacred drums were sounded, the linguists recited his lineage, and the people pledged their allegiance. The Golden Stool, hidden during years of conflict and colonial intrusion, was not publicly displayed but was invoked as the spiritual foundation of his authority. This moment reminded the people that while British colonialism had taken away their political independence, it had not destroyed their essence. Following his return, Prempe I worked to rebuild Ashanti institutions within the narrow space allowed by the colonial framework. He focused on reviving traditional courts, overseeing land administration, supporting cultural education, and maintaining ceremonial life. His palace once again became a center of social activity, where disputes were mediated, rituals were observed, and the stories of the ancestors were passed down. Importantly, Prempe I also became a bridge between the colonial government and the Ashanti people. Though limited in his official capacity, he used his influence to advocate for his people in matters of taxation, education, and social policy. He encouraged cooperation where necessary, but also protected the integrity of Ashanti customs. His conduct earned him respect not only among his own people, but even among some colonial administrators who came to see him as a stabilizing figure. The return of Prempe I also had broader implications for emerging nationalist sentiments in the Gold Coast. As educated elites in Accra, Cape Coast, and other regions began to call for greater self-government, the Ashanti revival added a powerful dimension to the growing sense of Ghanaian identity. The memory of Ashanti resistance, the resilience of its institutions, and the dignity of its leadership inspired future generations to think beyond colonial boundaries. Although Prempe I never regained the powers of the independent Asantehene, his final years were marked by a quiet victory. He had survived humiliation, exile, and political marginalization, yet returned to occupy a throne still revered by his people. His ability to adapt to colonial realities without surrendering cultural sovereignty set an important precedent. Under his guidance, the Ashanti kept their traditions alive, prepared for a new era, and maintained the cohesion of a society that had once ruled one of West Africa's most powerful empires. As the 20th century progressed and anti-colonial movements gained momentum across Africa, the people of the Gold Coast, soon to become Ghana, found themselves at the forefront of the continent's push for independence. The Ashanti, once the rulers of a powerful empire and later a subject people under British rule, played a vital and complex role in this transformation. Though their empire had fallen, the Ashanti had preserved their cultural institutions, political identity, and historical memory. These would now inform their participation in the creation of a modern African state. The Gold Coast had long been a mosaic of ethnic groups, kingdoms, and colonial settlements. The British had unified these disparate regions under a single administrative framework, but they had done so through coercion, treaties, and war. From the coastal Fante towns to the northern savanna regions and the Ashanti forests in the center, colonial rule imposed a fragile unity. As demands for self-rule emerged in the mid-20th century, the challenge was not only to expel colonial power, but also to forge a shared national identity among these diverse groups. In the years following the return and death of Prempe I, Ashanti political and cultural leadership continued to exert influence in regional and national affairs. The title of Asantehene remained important, not only as a ceremonial institution, but as a rallying point for Ashanti interests within the colonial framework. Traditional authority in Kumasi, backed by centuries of custom, stood in contrast to the growing influence of educated elites from coastal towns who advocated constitutional reform and self-government. Tensions occasionally surfaced between the traditional leadership in Ashanti and the emerging nationalist movements centered around political parties. These tensions were not always based on ideology. Instead, they reflected different historical experiences and regional perspectives. While the Ashanti elite valued the preservation of chieftaincy and customary law, political parties like the United Gold Coast Convention and later the Convention People's Party advocated for rapid decolonization, social reform, and the creation of a centralized modern state. However, the Ashanti were not isolated from these movements. Many Ashanti intellectuals, merchants, and civil servants participated in nationalist politics. They joined debates on education, representation, and economic development. Some supported moderate reformist parties, while others, especially younger members of the educated class, were drawn to the populist rhetoric of Kwame Nkrumah, whose Convention People's Party promised not only independence but also African unity and economic transformation. The Asante Confederacy Council, a body that represented the chiefs and traditional authorities of the Ashanti region, initially adopted a cautious approach. While it supported reforms that protected Ashanti autonomy, it was wary of nationalist parties that sought to subsume traditional authority under a new central government. Nevertheless, the council eventually recognized that the tide of history was turning and began to engage more directly with national politics. Throughout the 1940s and into the early 1950s, nationalist agitation grew stronger. Protests, strikes, and petitions became common, particularly in urban centers like Accra, Sekondi, and Kumasi. The colonial government responded with a mixture of concessions and repression. New constitutions were introduced to expand African participation in government, but these often fell short of expectations. In Kumasi, the capital of the Ashanti region, the legacy of empire shaped how people understood these changes. Many saw in the nationalist struggle an echo of their own ancestors' battles against foreign domination. The memory of the Golden Stool, the exile of Prempe I, and the leadership of Ya Asantewa inspired pride and political consciousness. Ashanti youth organizations, unions, and political clubs became active in demanding representation and reforms. By the early 1950s, Kwame Nkrumah and his Convention People's Party had gained significant popular support across the Gold Coast. Nkrumah's ability to mobilize the masses, articulate a vision of independence, and confront colonial authority won him admiration, but also concern among traditional rulers. In the Ashanti region, some chiefs feared that Nkrumah's policies would undermine the authority of the chieftaincy and centralize power in a way that disregarded regional autonomy. Indeed, political rivalry intensified during this period. The National Liberation Movement, formed in the mid-1950s and largely based in the Ashanti region, emerged as a powerful voice opposing Nkrumah's push for a unitary state. The movement, backed by several Ashanti chiefs and political activists, called for a federal system that would give greater power to regions and protect traditional institutions. Despite these tensions, the broader goal of independence united most political actors. As negotiations with the British continued and constitutional reforms were implemented, the momentum towards self-rule became irreversible. In a historic moment, the Gold Coast became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence from European rule, officially transitioning to the nation of Ghana in the year 1957. Ashanti participation in this process had been both influential and complex. While disagreements existed over the structure of the future state, there was no doubt that the Ashanti had contributed significantly to the intellectual, political, and cultural foundations of the new nation. The Asantehene and the Confederacy Council, though wary of the centralized power of the new government, recognized the importance of national unity and pledged to work within the framework of an independent Ghana. With independence, Ghana became a symbol for the rest of Africa, a beacon of hope, resistance, and possibility. For the Ashanti, it marked the next chapter in a long history of struggle, adaptation, and resilience. From the ancient battles against Denkyira to the wars with the British, from the exile of kings to their return in triumph, the Ashanti had journeyed through conquest, colonization, and finally, liberation. With Ghana's independence in the year 1957, the Ashanti people entered a new era, one where they were no longer resisting foreign rule, but instead helping to shape a sovereign African nation. Yet the Ashanti identity, deeply rooted in centuries of kingship, tradition, and cultural pride, did not dissolve into the background of national unity. Rather, it evolved alongside the modern state, contributing to Ghana's development while preserving its distinct historical character. In the early years of Ghana's independence, the role of traditional authority in a republican democracy posed significant challenges. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah envisioned a unified modern Ghana where the authority of the state reigned supreme. In this vision, the power of chiefs and traditional councils was viewed as an obstacle to progress, a relic of the past incompatible with the centralized institutions of modern governance. As a result, Nkrumah's government took steps to reduce the influence of chieftaincy, particularly in regions where chiefs were seen as opposing his policies. Laws were passed to limit the political power of traditional rulers, and chiefs were barred from participating in partisan politics. Some saw this as a necessary modernization of the state. Others viewed it as an attempt to weaken the historical autonomy of regions like Ashanti, where loyalty to tradition remained strong. Yet, despite these tensions, the Ashanti monarchy and its associated structures did not disappear. Instead, they adapted. The Asantehene continued to occupy a respected position, not as a political rival to the central government, but as a moral and cultural leader. The Golden Stool remained untouched, and Kumasi retained its significance as the spiritual and administrative heart of the Ashanti people. One of the most transformative moments in the modern history of Ashanti leadership came in the late 20th century with the installment of Asantehene Otumfuo Opoku Ware II. His reign, beginning in the early 1970s, marked a period of cultural revival and engagement with national development. Opoku Ware II focused on strengthening the institution of chieftaincy while also promoting education, infrastructure, and public health initiatives. He built bridges between the traditional authority and the modern state by emphasizing cooperation rather than confrontation. Under his leadership, the Asanteman Council worked with regional and national officials to implement development projects. Schools, clinics, and roads were established in both rural and urban areas, showing that traditional institutions could play a role in national progress without abandoning their core identity. After his passing, his successor, Otumfuo Osei Tutu II, was installed in the year 1999. His reign brought renewed visibility to the Ashanti monarchy, both within Ghana and internationally. With a modern education and a global outlook, Osei Tutu II brought innovation to the role of Asantehene. He launched initiatives such as the Otumfuo Education Fund, which has provided scholarships and educational support for thousands of students across Ghana. At the same time, he has remained a firm protector of Ashanti tradition. Ceremonies, festivals, and customs continue to be observed with reverence. The Adai and Akwasidai festivals draw visitors from around the country and beyond. These events are not only religious observances, but also opportunities for cultural affirmation, diplomacy, and community solidarity. Kumasi, the Ashanti capital, has retained its identity as a center of culture, commerce, and governance. While it is now a modern city with universities, markets, and highways, it is also a place where history is palpable. The Manhia Palace, home of the Asantehene, serves both as a residence and a symbol of continuity. Museums, monuments, and public art across the city reflect the legacy of the Ashanti Empire, keeping alive the memory of Asantewa, Prempe I, and other legendary figures. The role of the Ashanti in contemporary Ghana has continued to evolve. Chiefs and traditional councils remain influential in local governance, land management, and dispute resolution. Though they do not make laws or hold political office in the national parliament, their counsel is often sought on issues of community welfare, environmental management, and cultural preservation. In moments of national crisis or political tension, the voice of the Asantehene is often one of moderation and unity. His moral authority allows him to speak across party lines and ethnic boundaries. On multiple occasions, Ashanti leaders have played quiet but significant roles in mediating disputes and encouraging peaceful elections in Ghana's multi-party democracy. Economically, the Ashanti region remains vital to the nation. Gold mining continues to be a major industry, especially around Obuasi. Agriculture thrives in the fertile central belt, contributing cocoa, plantains, and other staple crops to the national economy. Kumasi's bustling Kejetia market, one of the largest in West Africa, is a hub of commerce that attracts traders from all corners of Ghana and neighboring countries. The Ashanti also maintain a vibrant artistic heritage. Kente cloth, with its intricate patterns and deep symbolism, is woven in the region and worn across the country for ceremonial occasions. Drumming, dancing, storytelling, and festivals keep the oral traditions of the people alive. Ashanti artisans continue to create carvings, stools, gold jewelry, and brasswork that reflect centuries of cultural knowledge. Importantly, the legacy of the Ashanti Empire has become a source of national pride for all Ghanaians, not just those of Ashanti descent. The story of resistance against colonial rule, the symbolism of the Golden Stool, and the leadership of figures like Asantewa and Prempe I are now integrated into Ghana's collective historical narrative. They are taught in schools, celebrated in national holidays, and remembered in literature, music, and art. Yet, challenges remain. In modern Ghana, the balance between traditional authority and democratic governance continues to evolve. Issues such as land ownership, youth unemployment, urban development, and political decentralization sometimes test the relationship between chiefs and elected officials. Additionally, younger generations, exposed to global culture and digital technology, often engage with tradition in new ways, seeking to reconcile heritage with modern aspirations. As we near the end of this historical journey through the rise, fall, and resurgence of the Ashanti Empire, it becomes necessary to pause, not only to recount events, but to reflect on the broader meanings of this remarkable story. For over 3 centuries, the Ashanti people have stood as a powerful example of how tradition, resilience, and adaptation can shape both local identity and global historical narratives. The Ashanti Empire began not with conquest, but with alliance. In the forested heart of what is now Ghana, scattered Akan-speaking chiefdoms came together under the leadership of Osei Tutu and the spiritual guidance of Okomfo Anokie. Their unification, symbolized through the mystical descent of the Golden Stool, created a foundation for collective identity that transcended clan and territory. This was not merely a political arrangement. It was the birth of a nation grounded in spiritual belief, cultural continuity, and shared purpose. From the outset, The Ashanti Empire demonstrated remarkable political sophistication. Its administrative structure was organized yet flexible. The Asantehene ruled from Kumasi, but did so through a confederation of chiefs who maintained local autonomy while pledging allegiance to the empire's core values. This balance between centralized and decentralized governance allowed the empire to grow while respecting the diversity of its component communities. The Ashanti were also skilled diplomats, traders, and military strategists. Their interactions with European powers were not marked by naivety, but by negotiation, alliance building, and strategic confrontation. Whether dealing with the Dutch, the Danes, or the British, the Ashanti sought to protect their sovereignty while securing access to global trade networks, particularly the trade in gold and kola, and, in earlier periods, slaves. And yet, the Ashanti were not isolated from the darker currents of regional history. The empire's involvement in the transatlantic and regional slave trade, though often initiated to satisfy foreign demand, raises difficult moral questions. Like many pre-colonial African states, the Ashanti navigated a complex moral and political landscape, where power, commerce, and survival were intertwined in ways that modern sensibilities may find troubling. Acknowledging these dimensions is essential for understanding the full humanity and complexity of Ashanti history. The Ashanti's resistance to British imperialism stands among the most determined and enduring struggles in African colonial history. From the early conflicts over Elmina to the final stand during the War of the Golden Stool, the Ashanti refused to submit passively to foreign domination. They were not simply reacting to invasion. They were defending a worldview, a political system, and a spiritual heritage. Even when defeated militarily, they preserved their identity through cultural institutions, oral tradition, and the sacred authority of the Golden Stool. This long arc of resistance and resilience shaped the Ashanti's place in post-colonial Ghana. Far from disappearing after independence, the Ashanti continued to influence national life through education, commerce, politics, and cultural leadership. Their story is now part of Ghana's national consciousness, taught in schools and celebrated in literature and art. It reminds Ghanaians that their modern state was not built on colonial foundations alone, but also on centuries of indigenous governance and achievement. In global context, the Ashanti legacy contributes to a more nuanced understanding of African history. Too often, the African continent has been portrayed in simplistic terms, either as a place of timeless tribalism or as a passive victim of European conquest. The Ashanti story challenges these narratives. It offers a case study in African statecraft, diplomacy, military resistance, and cultural survival. It invites scholars, educators, and learners worldwide to rethink assumptions and explore the richness of African civilizations. Moreover, the symbolism of the Golden Stool speaks to universal human themes. The belief that the soul of a people can reside in a sacred object, passed through generations, protected at all costs, and never surrendered, resonates beyond the Ashanti world. It is a metaphor for collective memory, for the values that bind communities, and for the power of symbols to endure even when empires fall. The continued relevance of the Ashanti monarchy in 21st century Ghana is not merely ceremonial. It represents a successful integration of tradition into a modern state. While many African countries have struggled with the question of how to incorporate indigenous systems of governance, the Ashanti model offers a compelling example of continuity without stagnation. The Asantehene does not wield political power in the conventional sense, but he remains an influential voice in national debates, a patron of education and health, and a symbol of dignity for millions. This success is partly due to the ability of the Ashanti institution to adapt. It has embraced modernity where necessary, engaging with media, supporting development projects, and collaborating with state institutions while preserving its ritual, hierarchy, and spiritual foundations. This careful balance allows it to speak to both past and future, tradition and innovation. Furthermore, the Ashanti diaspora, both within Ghana and across the world, continues to connect people to their heritage. In cities from Accra to London to New York, Ashanti descendants celebrate their culture through language, music, dress, and ceremony. The Golden Stool may remain in Kumasi, but its meaning echoes in the hearts of those who carry its legacy abroad. In the global age, where identities are increasingly complex and interconnected, the Ashanti example holds particular resonance. It shows how rootedness in tradition can be a source of strength, not limitation. It affirms that indigenous systems of knowledge, authority, and belief are not obstacles to development, but vital elements of a plural and inclusive future. The long journey of the Ashanti Empire, from its foundation in the forested interior of West Africa to its place in the modern nation of Ghana, offers more than just a record of historical events. It presents a series of enduring lessons about the nature of leadership, resilience, cultural preservation, and identity. As one of the most well-documented pre-colonial African empires, the Ashanti experience allows us to rethink the African past not as a backdrop to colonialism, but as a dynamic and instructive force in its own right. At the heart of the Ashanti story is the understanding that political power is most sustainable when it is rooted in shared belief and collective memory. The Golden Stool, as a sacred embodiment of the Ashanti people's soul, was not simply an object of royal prestige. It symbolized the moral and spiritual foundation of governance. This principle shaped how rulers were selected, how wars were waged, and how justice was administered. It bound people together across clans, regions, and generations. Unlike many European monarchies of the same period, Ashanti kingship was not determined by absolute authority or divine right in isolation. The Asantehene was accountable to a council of chiefs and elders, and his legitimacy depended on maintaining harmony with the ancestors, the gods, and the people. This system of checks and balances ensured that power was not wielded arbitrarily, but negotiated through established norms, rituals, and community consensus. Another key lesson is the centrality of adaptation in political survival. The Ashanti Empire did not remain static. From its founding under Osei Tutu and Okomfo Anokye to its military expansions under successive rulers, the empire constantly adjusted its strategies in response to internal pressures and external threats. When confronted by European merchants and missionaries, the Ashanti navigated diplomacy with intelligence and caution. When faced with British aggression, they resisted through both warfare and negotiation. Even after defeat and annexation, the Ashanti did not dissolve into colonial submission. They preserved their institutions, protected their sacred symbols, and eventually reclaimed their voice through cultural resilience and political pragmatism. This ability to evolve without abandoning core identity is a powerful reminder that tradition is not inherently conservative or inflexible. When grounded in meaning and purpose, it can be a source of innovation and strength. The Ashanti also offer important insights into the relationship between memory and history. Their oral traditions, royal genealogies, festivals, and proverbs form a rich archive of cultural wisdom. These traditions preserved knowledge even when written records were scarce or controlled by outsiders. Long before Western historians wrote about the Ashanti themselves were preserving, interpreting, and transmitting their own past. This challenges the notion that African societies without early written scripts were somehow without history. The Ashanti demonstrate that historical consciousness can thrive in oral form, shaping identity, informing decisions, and connecting generations. It is through this oral framework that figures like Ya Asantewa are remembered not just as historical actors, but as enduring symbols of resistance, leadership, and womanhood. In the modern global conversation about heritage and representation, the Ashanti legacy also highlights the importance of narrative sovereignty. Too often, African histories have been told through colonial perspectives, filtered through foreign interpretations that prioritize conquest over culture and deficit over dignity. The Ashanti story, however, asserts itself with clarity and force. It refuses to be reduced to footnotes in European expansion. It insists on its own logic, rhythms, and values. This insistence matters, not just for historical accuracy, but for the dignity of present and future generations. When African children learn about the Ashanti Empire, they encounter examples of complexity, sophistication, and pride. They see that African civilizations developed systems of government, philosophy, art, and law long before colonizers arrived. They understand that they inherit a legacy of builders, thinkers, and leaders. For the global community, the Ashanti also remind us that empire is not a uniquely Western phenomenon. Empires rise and fall across the world, from the Han in China to the Mughal in India, from the Inca in South America to the Ashanti in West Africa. Each has its own architecture of power and expression of identity. Studying the Ashanti within this broader context contributes to a more balanced and inclusive understanding of world history. Moreover, the Ashanti experience invites reflection on the ethics of power. Their leaders were not without flaws. Wars of expansion, internal rivalries, and participation in the slave trade are parts of their history that deserve honest scrutiny. But unlike some imperial projects that erased local cultures or imposed uniformity through violence, the Ashanti generally ruled through integration, negotiation, and cultural continuity. Their empire expanded not by obliterating diversity, but by incorporating it into a shared symbolic and administrative framework. In our present century, where the politics of identity, heritage, and globalization often collide, the Ashanti example offers a valuable model of coexistence. It teaches that unity need not mean uniformity, and that strength can emerge from the respectful accommodation of difference. The confederate nature of the Ashanti Empire allowed for multiple voices within a single polity, an idea that resonates with modern discussions about federalism, regional autonomy, and plural governance. Another profound lesson lies in the symbolic power of resistance. The Ashanti did not win every battle against colonial rule, but they won the war for memory. The Golden Stool was never surrendered. The institution of the Asantehene was never extinguished. Ya Asantewa's defiance still echoes through history, not because it reversed conquest, but because it affirmed humanity. Resistance, in the Ashanti case, was not limited to armed struggle. It included the preservation of language, the continuation of ritual, the maintenance of family structures, and the cultivation of values. It was quiet as well as loud, subtle as well as dramatic. And it worked. Not in reclaiming the old empire, but in ensuring that the future would not be built on erasure. Across the arc of African history, few stories are as textured, enduring, and impactful as that of the Ashanti Empire. From its deliberate formation through spiritual unity and political foresight, to its expansion into one of the most powerful indigenous states in West Africa and its survival through colonization, the Ashanti experience offers far more than a regional narrative. It offers a window into what African civilization has been, what it has endured, and what it can teach a world still reckoning with the legacy of empire, identity, and resistance. At its foundation, the Ashanti Empire demonstrated that African political systems were not static or simplistic. The Ashanti developed a confederated structure that allowed multiple chiefdoms to maintain their autonomy while contributing to a larger national identity. This model of governance was flexible, consultative, and deeply tied to cultural symbols and oral history. The Golden Stool was not merely a throne, it was a repository of collective memory and a reminder that political legitimacy is rooted in shared values, not just force. The deliberate fusion of politics and spirituality is one of the Ashanti's most defining and instructive contributions. Unlike many empires that ruled through external compulsion or imposed ideologies, the Ashanti developed an internal moral logic. Kings were accountable not only to their people, but also to ancestral traditions and divine principles. Councils of elders, priests, and linguists were not ornamental. They were the pillars of public deliberation and ethical balance. Through military victories and cultural diplomacy, the Ashanti extended their influence across the forest belt and beyond. Yet, their strength was not only in weapons or territory, it was also in their ability to bind people through language, law, ritual, and commerce. The marketplace of Kumasi, the rhythms of drum language, and the intricacies of Ashanti goldwork were as much instruments of power as any army. The empire was a space of negotiation, innovation, and exchange, a living organism that adapted to new realities while defending its soul. The colonial encounter, though devastating in its economic and political consequences, did not destroy this soul. The British, despite their military superiority and administrative strategies, never fully subdued the essence of Ashanti identity. The sacred Golden Stool remained hidden and intact. Even as the Asantehene was exiled, the memory of kingship endured in the hearts of the people. Oral tradition preserved what written proclamations could not erase. The resistance of the Ashanti to colonialism, especially under the leadership of figures like Osei Tutu, has come to symbolize a wider African struggle for dignity. Her defiance in the face of overwhelming odds remains a powerful lesson in the role of women in leadership and the capacity of communities to protect their core symbols. That the British never laid eyes on the Golden Stool was more than a strategic victory. It was a declaration of spiritual sovereignty. In the post-colonial era, the Ashanti region became central not only to Ghana's economy and culture, but also to its national identity. Kumasi, as a city, balanced its pre-colonial heritage with modern development. The Asantehene, far from being relegated to mere symbolism, evolved into a partner in national progress, supporting education, infrastructure, and civic engagement. The continued reverence for chieftaincy, especially among the youth, showed that tradition could coexist with modern aspirations. Globally, the Ashanti story challenges outdated narratives about Africa as a continent without civilization or history before European arrival. It reminds scholars, students, and observers that African societies developed complex systems of governance, law, spirituality, and economics on their own terms. The Ashanti were not simply resisting foreign ideas, they were defending institutions that had evolved through centuries of trial, adaptation, and communal vision. The empire also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Like many powers of its era, the Ashanti were entangled in the trade of enslaved persons. While this commerce was often mediated through European demand and infrastructure, the participation of African states in the system of slavery must be acknowledged with honesty and depth. Understanding this does not diminish the achievements of the Ashanti, but rather humanizes them, placing them within the broader context of global historical entanglement. In the 21st century, the legacy of the Ashanti Empire continues to grow. Digital archives, cultural festivals, scholarly work, and global diasporic communities ensure that the story is not forgotten. In a world searching for rooted identities and authentic models of development, the Ashanti experience offers vital insights. To African nations grappling with the challenges of state-building, ethnic diversity, and post-colonial identity, the Ashanti Confederacy demonstrates the possibility of political unity that respects cultural pluralism. To educators and students, it provides a counter-narrative to Eurocentric history, a testament to African agency and innovation. To the world at large, it is a reminder that power can be shaped not only by conquest, but by consensus, spiritual commitment, and cultural depth. Above all, the Ashanti story teaches that the past is never fully past. It lives in the symbols we protect, the languages we speak, the festivals we celebrate, and the institutions we uphold. The Golden Stool, whether seen or unseen, continues to inspire. It remains a silent but powerful emblem of continuity, a bridge between ancestors and descendants, between memory and destiny. As this documentary journey comes to a close, we leave with not only facts and timelines, but with a deeper appreciation for what it means to be part of a living history. The Ashanti Empire has fallen, risen, and transformed, but it has never been forgotten. And as long as its stories are told, its values practiced, and its symbols respected, the spirit of the Ashanti will endure. Let the wisdom of their ancestors guide us, the strength of their resistance empower us, And the beauty of their culture remind us that greatness is not only measured in victories or monuments, but in the courage to defend one's identity through time. This is the story of the Ashanti Empire, eternal, evolving, and alive.